Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special video. I've been thinking about doing something along this line for a while, but since there seems to be a little bit more interest than normal around the development of the Japanese naval air arms, since of course they were the opposite number to some of the largest naval battles in the Pacific, it seemed like as good an opportunity as any to discuss one particular aircraft about which an awful lot is said and an awful lot is written, and an awful lot of which is wrong. That being the A6M Zero or Zeke or whatever the Japanese ended up calling it. um, yeah, this thing has an awful lot written and said about it. As I said, it's some people say it was God's gift to fighters. Other people say it was old, slow, and obsolete and easily overpowered, and everything in between. So I thought, well, rather than me give a brief pre-say about it, how about actually asking someone who knows pretty much everything bar possibly how to construct one from scratch? Welcome to my guest.
Hi, my name's Justin. I guess very briefly provide background. I have an MA in military history, specifically intelligence history, but my main marching grounds are the Asia Pacific War, interwar period, focusing predominantly on Japan. I'm sure some of you are familiar with me. I've popped up on a couple of other YouTube channels, but yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And again, thank you very much for coming. So obviously, particularly recently, the A6M has appeared on screen in a movie about one of the larger battles in the Pacific War, which we shall not talk about too much to avoid the rage inducement that may occur. But nevertheless, in this video, this is mainly going to be Justin telling us the information, and I'll chip in occasionally with observations or further questions. So let's get on with that. So the first question that I thought would be relevant is, so to put things in a bit of context, what aircraft did the A6M actually take over from, and when was the A6M designed? What aircraft was it contemporary with? Because this sort of often forms a bit of a confusion when it's compared to other aircraft like the Wildcat or the Hellcat or the Fulmar, etc.
hmm Well, so the aircraft it took over from was helpfully named the A5M. Um, Type 96 carrier fighter is the general type designation. And that was the immediate predecessor to the Zero. The prototype first flew in January 1935, and then it started to roll out to units early 1937. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the A5M because obviously that's not the point of the video, but in short, it performed very well in combat. It could certainly be counted among the finest fighters in the world at that time. It was also the first all-metal monoplane carrier fighter to enter service in any of the world's navies. It could reasonably be argued that the A5M and its bomber counterpart, the G3M, marked a more important phase in the development of Japanese military aircraft than their more famous successors, the Zero and then the G4M. Because they both represented the culmination of years of effort within Japan to develop indigenous aircraft designs that were competitive with the other leading powers. And with the A5M and the G3M, they finally accomplished that, at least on the Navy side. Um, One random little bit of information is that the first Japanese fighters engaged by the U.S. Navy's F4F Wildcat in February 1942 were not Zeros, unlike that mid-May movie, but A5Ms. It may be bizarre to some American viewers, but the Central Pacific, the area closest to the U.S. and Pearl Harbor in particular, was actually a low priority area for the Japanese Navy in this early phase of the war. What you could call, I guess, the main show for the Japanese Navy was occurring in Southeast Asia, hence why these older aircraft, in that case, a modest number of A5Ms and G3Ms, made up the Japanese offensive air power in the region.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess moving on to the Zero specifically,
hmm
the preliminary specifications were submitted to Mitsubishi and Nakajima on the 19th of May, 1937. Thinking back to the A5M, that's pretty much right at the time that the A5M was just entering service. So they were already thinking about the next plane. The specifications were then revised a bit in October 1937 based on combat experience in China. We'll get to specific design requirements in a few minutes. Anyway, so Nakajima took one look at them and they pulled out of the competition, but Mitsubishi decided to push ahead with their design. The prototype's first flight was April 1st, 1939, and then it was re-engined to the engine it would eventually have in the production model, the Nakajima Sape 12. And the first prototype powered by that engine flew on the 28th of December 1939. I'll take a little side note for a second here. I have to mention that the Zero was used exclusively by the Japanese Navy Air Service. The Japanese had two different air services, a Navy Air Service and an Army Air Service, subordinated to their respective armed services. You'll occasionally see books claim otherwise or talk about, quote, Army Zeros, but that's incorrect. The Army didn't, I don't even know if they got to touch a Zero, much less actually fly one. Combat trials started on July 21st, 1940, and then the Zero claimed its first victims on September 13th, 1940. In that action, 12th Kokutai's A6M2s were scheduled to escort some bombers. They were targeting Chongqing, the wartime capital of China. They faced 15 I-15 BIS and 9 I-16 fighters of the Chinese Air Force. 4 Zeros were damaged in exchange for 13 aircraft destroyed and 11 damaged on the Chinese side. You'll often see books state that 27 aircraft were shot down, but those were Japanese claims, not confirmed kills. To go off on a slight tangent, because this is going to become a theme throughout this entire thing, and honestly, it's one of the most fundamental things you have to understand when you're looking at air power, is that everybody overclaimed significantly. And I do mean everybody. You never take kill claims at face value. If it's the only figure you have, then you have to make sure that you state specifically that it's a claim. Just as one example, during the air campaigns over New Guinea, the Allies, so that's Royal Australian Air Force, USAF fighters, USAF bomber gunners, and AA gun crews, they claimed over 400 Tainan Kokutai Zeros over the span of this campaign. In reality, 44 Tainan pilots were killed when their planes were shot down or crashed during the campaign. So of those 44, 12 were lost to operational causes or weather. So when you do the math, that's a claim to kill ratio of 12.5 to 1. I assure you the Tainan Kokutai wish they had over 400 Zeros for the Allies to shoot down. Over the course of the New Guinea campaign, the Tainan Kokutai took part in, both sides had a claim to kill ratio of roughly 7 to 1. And I'll read a really short excerpt on this, actually, in an excellent unit history of the Tainan Kokutai.
Sure.
So, quote, the most contentious issue to arise from a detailed study of this account is overclaiming. With so much invested by so many in the prestige of the tally of kills, the reality is set to disappoint. A cold analysis of overall claims reveals that both sides overclaimed by a ratio of around 7 to 1, i.e., for every 7 claims, only 1 was a kill. This conclusion unfortunately challenges the very platforms upon which many prestigious reputations have been built over the past 7 decades. However, the evidence is irrefutable. There are many reasons behind this state of affairs, most of them honorable. Combat was usually fleeting. Witness cases of some Riko or Japanese bomber crews that were unaware that they had even been attacked. Whilst longer combats such as occurred in chases did occur, the norm was a very short encounter with a few hundred rounds fired. And then just skip a little bit over some detail here. In such a dangerous setting with complex and speedy movements, it is easy to see how several different pilots could claim against the same aircraft. We see many instances where Allied pilots are positive of a kill only for the record to confirm that their alleged victim happily cruised back to Leh or Rabaul unscathed. Optimism will win over reality in any treacherous environment, and New Guinea's wartime skies were no exception, end quote. And that's, again, just one example. It happened everywhere. I could talk about this for 30 minutes, just explaining the million different ways that overclaiming occurred, but we're not going to do that.
Fair enough, though. I mean, it kind of actually reminds me of the shoot down of Admiral Yamamoto, where for a while after the P-38s came back, they were absolutely adamant that they'd shot down 3 bombers, despite the fact that the aerial convoy only had 2.
Yeah, and that kind of thing is widespread. Just as one random example specific to the Pacific War, in fact, specific to the Zero of the A6M2, when they engaged overboost, which is what you'd call, I guess, wartime emergency power, WEP, it would leave a smoke trail, a visible, very visible smoke trail. Of course, if you're an American pilot, you're flying around at several hundred kilometers an hour, you're trying not to be killed, your adrenaline's going like crazy, zero flashes in front of your gun sights for a second, you shoot, you see smoke, and then you never see that zero again. Then you make a
You,
kill claim. But in reality, all that happened is he flew in front of you, you shot, he engaged his overboost, and smoke came out of the engine, and then he flew off somewhere. And that's just one of a billion different ways that overclaiming happens. And it's not them lying; it's just that's the reality of aerial combat.
yeah.
So I guess to put the zero into its context, so talking about contemporaries, and this isn't an exact science. Um, I tried to stick to aircraft that were actually either entering combat or had been in combat and were still kind of forming the front line at that point in time. So we're not getting into wacky prototypes and all of that stuff that, or for example, I've omitted from December 1941, I omitted the Typhoon because the Typhoon was a raging dumpster fire for the first year of its entry to service.
That's
It
being
would,
generous.
yeah. But here we go. So for July 1940, so again, this is when the Zero first entered combat, or the combat zone.
Hmm.
Um, for Germany, the Bf 109 E4 was the newest aircraft, but it was the air fleet was still mostly made up of E1s and E3s, so older variants. For the UK, it's the Hurricane Mark 1 with the Hurricane Mark 2 shortly turning up, and then the similar story for the Spitfire Mark 1, and then a little later Mark 2. US, the F4, F3, kinda, it's actually a few months newer than the Zero. Then the Buffalo's hanging around, P40, I didn't even bother trying to sort out P40 variants. I was going to do it, and then I'm like, I'm just not, it's not happening.
No.
But various variants of the P40. So if we fast forward to December 1941, which of course is a pretty significant date, um, Germany at that point has the Bf 109 F4. The Fokker Wolves are starting to creep into service, so you're at about the Fokker Wolf 190 A2 A3. The UK, they're still rocking some Hurricane Mark 2s, but also Spitfire Mark 5s. The US F4 F3 by this point is solidly in service. They've still got Buffaloes in frontline service, and at this point, it's the P40E is the latest variant there. And there's also some older stuff in service with the US that I'm P35s and stuff, but whatever.
Yeah.
USSR, I threw in for December 1941. They got I-16 still in frontline service, Leg 3, Yak 1, Yak 7 in very small numbers. That's kind of puts the Zero in its context. One thing that this makes, that I really want to stress, is that Zero, by the time it sees combat against the F4F kind of in the spring of 1942, it's not a brand new fighter. It's been in frontline service for at that point over a year and a half, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. Just because it was new to Americans fighting, it didn't make it a new fighter.
Yeah, I mean, looking at that list, I mean, two things stand out to me immediately, especially with the UK and US fighters that were contemporary to it in July 1940, which is that the A6M is replacing the A5M, but the A5M's already a monoplane, whereas the
Mhm.
Hurricane and the Spitfire are in the UK, they're replacing the Gladiator, and the F4F is replacing the F2F and F3F, which are also biplane fighters.
Mhm.
So I guess I suppose you could almost the A6M it's a second generation monoplane at a time when a lot of other countries that are notionally typically thought of as being more advanced are actually only bringing in their first gen monoplane fighters.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point to make. As I mentioned, the A5M, particularly in the naval context, was a pretty novel aircraft for the time. It had some features that were a bit um, dated, for example, the fixed landing gear. But overall, it was a nifty little fighter. Um,
Yeah.
I won't go as far as to say at some books, and you see a lot of this overstatement about
Hmm.
everything. I think every reference book you open up, they'll always say such and such was the best fighter introduced at such a point in time, and I think it's just kind of a lack of scope. They have knowledge of this one fighter that ends up being good, and then they don't bother looking at what everybody else was doing. Because when you put the A5M alongside a lot of the stuff that was in service, it's not like it was leagues ahead of everything else. It was, but it stood among them, with
Yeah.
pluses and minuses.
Yeah, and I think what you said as well about the when the F4Fs encounter them first, that also probably also bears a important point because I suppose if you're talking about the mid 1942 period, if somebody showed up in a Spitfire Mark One, you'd probably be looking at them going, "Yeah, yeah, go back a couple of years. You're out of date, mate." And similarly, if you sort of if you're well, we know although obviously it did get exaggerated a bit, but the Buffaloes did get rather badly beaten up as well in that
Mhm.
period. But the A6M is contemporary with those aircraft, as we just said. So that I mean, obviously we'll talk more about their combat performance further down the line, but it's an important point to bear out that it's as you said, it's not like the Zero is brand new just off the production line in the way that say the F4 F3 is almost at that point.
Mhm. Yeah, the F-403, I guess that they entered from memory November 1940,
Hmm.
and I can't remember when it reached units, but so yeah, it's a little bit newer than the F4F. But I guess one thing to drive home is that real life is not like War Thunder or World of Warships or any of those games where you always match like with a battle rating system or tiers or whatever. I mean, when the opening carrier raids, it's F4Fs that were beating the crap out of little U5Ms that, for the most part, were pretty much hopeless because by that point they're well past their best before date.
Yeah.
Um, I always think too of Kirishima versus Washington, and
Yeah. Well, it's yeah. I suppose it highlights a lot of the difference between aircraft and warships in that you can
hmm
have something like yeah, the A5M is introduced about 5 years before that fight, and in 5 years it's gone from being decent frontline fighter to hopelessly obsolete when faced
hmm
with non-opposition. Whereas if you looked at something like I don't know, a late generation Town class cruiser or maybe a New Orleans class heavy cruiser, they're still absolute top of the line frontline combatants in 1942,
hmm
and will remain so for a while.
hmm Yeah, the time scale you're operating on, particularly from I'd say the mid 1930s and then into the war proper for aviation, is nuts. That's like a whole other discussion in and of itself. But how rapid?
Yeah.
I mean, you move from, for example, in the Japanese Navy, you go from a series of biplanes that had pretty much been in service for almost the entirety of the 1920s. And then you replace them with more biplanes, and then you immediately replace those with monoplanes, and then you immediately replace those with the second generation of monoplanes, and then the war starts. Um,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of rapid development at the end.
Yeah. So sort of looping back to the Zero itself, what lessons did the Japanese Navy take into account when they were designing it? Because obviously they had the Sino-Japanese War going on,
Mhm.
one of many Sino-Japanese wars, um, the latest iteration, I suppose. But yeah, so were they taking into account combat lessons when they were putting it together?
Yeah, they certainly will. They certainly were because the modifications were, or the specifications rather, were revised. Many of the requirements for the Zero were extremely ambitious, but you can kind of draw a line just built off the predecessor. It was just the A5M, but more. Um, the real lesson that came to the fore in a very big way during development was the need for a long-range escort fighter. The A5M, it wasn't really short-ranged for its day, but it definitely lacked the reach needed to escort the land-based attack aircraft deep into China. Many of these unescorted bombing raids, they'd be mauled by enemy interceptors. There was a general trend, of course, within the Japanese Navy of, quote, outranging the enemy that likely played some factor. But really, the main overwhelming was they needed a fighter with extreme range to escort their bombers on deep strikes. Nicholas Millman, one historian of the Zero, he described the aircraft actually as the world's first truly long-range strategic escort fighter, and I think that's a very accurate description. Many works will talk about the impact of the war in China in relation to aircraft maneuverability. I personally don't see it because when you look at the Japanese aircraft design before the war, the same arguments had been happening since the early 1930s, and they kind of just continued through the so-called China incident, as the Japanese referred to it at the time. You would just see people that were arguing for more maneuverability, and then they'd pull examples from the China theater and say, haha, this is supporting our position. And then the other people would scream back that they need more speed and range and sacrifice maneuverability, and then they'd point to examples in the China theater to support their position. So it was kind of just, it gave them a new pool of examples to pull from, but the two sides were pretty entrenched at this point. It's also worth noting that the Japanese Army Air Service was far more insistent on maneuverability than the Navy in this period, and that's actually reflected in the aircraft that they ended up getting. So as far as design specifications for the Zero, as mentioned earlier, the initial 12 specifications were issued by the Navy in the 19th of May, 1937, so that's before the war in China escalates in a huge way in July 1937. They revised in October of that year, which is about a month after things have started to, a few months after. And then I think, I'm trying to remember something off the date off the top of my head. That's a disaster. I think it's September 1937. Things start escalating around Shanghai. And that's where the Navy Air Service really gets dragged into things. So a month after that, they're already revising specifications based on combat experience. According to Millman, 20 new requirements were modified or added. Fortunately, he doesn't list them, but I'll give you at least the requirements as they were rewritten in October.
Yeah.
So, purpose. Escort fighter with dogfight performance superior to that of its opponents. It also must be an interceptor capable of destroying enemy attackers. Maximum speed of 270 knots at 4,000 meters, it's 500 kilometers an hour. Rate of climb less than 3.5 minutes to 3,000 meters in altitude. Endurance 1.5 to 2 hours at normal rated power, or 6 to 8 hours at economical cruising speed with a drop tank. They don't give the specification doesn't give the range in kilometers, so I actually put the real ones in there. About 1,870 kilometers on an internal fuel, or 3,120 kilometers with a drop tank, which, and I cannot stress this enough, is mind-bogglingly insane for a fighter of that period.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just comment on that, I suppose another way of putting that into context is that when the Allied bombing raids start on Germany in the middle of the war, aircraft like the Spitfires and such like can't make that full round trip. And they can later on introduce drop tanks. They can just about make it, but they still can't get to the more distant targets like Munich or Berlin. And then obviously you have things like the P-47 and the P-51 coming in, and this is hailed as a huge advance, and they're long-range escort fighters, etc. But the distance between the middle of England and the sort of maybe Leipzig, Nuremberg area, mid to eastern Germany, is only about just under 600 miles in roughly straight line.
Mm-hmm.
So comparatively, I mean, 600 miles is what, but just under 1,000 kilometers. So comparatively speaking, the Zero has almost double that range and is an aircraft that's sort of available 2 or 3 years before the Allies even start to think of half that range as a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's huge. Moving on, armament. They required two 20-millimeter cannon and two 7.7-millimeter MGs, and also the ability to carry two 60-kilogram bombs. By the way, those two 60-kilogram bombs, they were envisioned to use as kind of, I guess, what we would in modern parlance term SEAD, or suppression of enemy air defense. But it was doctrinal that the Zeros would strafe, but also drop 60-kilogram bombs, for example, on ships to soften them up for torpedo bombers and things like that to come in.
Okay.
Full radio equipment was also a requirement, including direction finding. That's another relatively novel feature, the direction finding component specifically, for a single engine fighter of the period. Takeoff run less than 70 meters with a 27-knot headwind. I can't possibly think of what that's for. Dogfighting performance at least equal to that of the A6M. And ultimately, the A6M2, which is the first production variant, met or exceeded all of these requirements, with the one exception of low-speed maneuverability compared to the A6M, because it just wasn't going to happen. Frankly, that's a good thing because the sacrifices needed to accomplish that would have made the Zero far less impressive than it ended up being. In fact, Horikoshi recalls after a particularly heated debate where he was getting yelled at by people for the Zero not being maneuverable enough. He sketched out a different design that omitted the cannons. He changed a whole bunch of things. It got way slower, but then it had turned into A5M 2.0 that would just be able to turn on a dime. And but he thankfully he looked at that and went, nope, it's not going to have any kind of staying power. It's pretty much going to be obsolete upon arrival with no chance to upgrade. So he threw that out and kind of doubled down on the design that he ended up producing. Horikoshi, I haven't explained who Horikoshi is. Jiro Horikoshi was the lead designer or the head of the design team that designed the Zero. He wasn't alone. I don't have everybody else's name, but he was the head guy. So he recalled being completely floored by the requirements, and I don't blame him. Right away, the Zero was being called to do everything. It needed to be an escort fighter, and a bomber interceptor, and a carrier fighter. The dichotomy between escort and interceptor was the most troublesome because there's a lot of mutual contradictions there. The former demanded long range, and then you usually sacrifice speed, and then just enough performance to deal with enemy interceptors, while the latter demanded high rate of climb, strong armament, high speed, way shorter range. But they wanted both. All of this had to be accomplished in a plane, of course, with that ever-present specter that it needed to also be able to fly off an aircraft carrier. Um, in Horikoshi's words, the requirement, quote, defied common sense, end quote. He also noted that the Japanese had limited resources and had to deal with constant pressure between the Yokosuka Kokutai, responsible for operational evaluation, and all they wanted was a dogfighter extraordinaire. And then the Naval Air Technical Arsenal, which was responsible for flight testing, they wanted long range to be given the absolute priority, even if it sacrificed dogfighting performance. So now you can kind of see why Nakajima looked at the requirements and they're just like, nope. And they left the competition immediately because they thought it was just a poison pill and any attempt was going to be doomed to failure. Horikoshi, after his initial shock, he started to sketch some stuff out and he went, oh, maybe I can actually meet the requirements. And as I mentioned above, he actually managed to pull it off.
Hmm. Okay, so quite the ambition when they came up with those design specs.
Hmm.
Um, so one of the other things that's often said about the Zero is that there were suboptimal design choices made due to limitations in the Japanese avionics and aircraft industry. Is there any actual particular merit to that?
There is and there isn't. Mostly isn't in this one specific case of the Zero, where it didn't really have an overwhelming impact, despite the extreme requirements and the infighting over what the Zero should be. And that's really to the credit of Horikoshi and the rest of the design team. The aircraft that came out the other end wasn't badly compromised in any way for the time. If you want to look at an aircraft that was badly compromised by certain features within Japanese industry, that would be the Army's Nakajima Ki 43, which there, as I mentioned earlier, the Army Air Service was far more insistent on extreme maneuverability, and they forced this requirement on Nakajima. And the plane they got, well, one, it was stuck in development hell forever. And then when it finally came out the other end, it was now. This is where technical specifications and reality kind of diverge because it performed well, but honestly, it was pretty much obsolete upon arrival, with very little room to meaningfully upgrade it. And that's kind of what you get on one end of the spectrum. But the Zero actually came out fairly well balanced. The one significant limitation that really did force Horikoshi and the rest of the design team to really buckle down was the power output of available engines. Uh, Aero engine design and also propeller design were the two probably biggest disadvantages within the Japanese aviation industry. Eventually, the engine that they ended up putting on it, the Saka 12, power output of it was modest for the time. The A6M1, which you almost never hear about, that was the initial prototype with a much less powerful engine. Um, Thankfully, the Sockeye 12 came along on the third prototype, which would become the A6M2, and it was such a huge boost to Horikoshi and the team because finally they had an engine that was pretty, at least within spitting distance of contemporary foreign engines in that category. So the Sockeye put out a modest, though not bad for the time, power of about 950 horsepower. That's roughly 100 to 250 horsepower lower than you would see on some near contemporaries, like the F4F, for example, had a, I think, 1150 horsepower engine, if memory serves. So it's a noteworthy difference, but not the end of the world. The Sake 12 itself was actually stupendous. It was small, rugged, extremely reliable. It powered a whole number of famous Japanese aircraft. However, the modest power output and combined with the extremely ambitious requirements ensured that Mitsubishi really needed to be absolutely ruthless with weight reduction and aerodynamic efficiency. That isn't necessarily suboptimal, but it greatly complicated the design process, and it also meant the Zero would be a tricky plane to upgrade looking down the road, because what came out the other end around this restriction is an aircraft that was exceptionally well balanced. And the second you started adding a little bits of weight here and there, it started that you would get massive performance drops that you hadn't that they really hadn't anticipated. Now
Okay.
there's a couple of elephants in the room, that being armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. I'm sure people are screaming at their monitors
Mhm.
about it. We have a whole section on it. It's coming. Uh, Save your angry comments for later.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. When you talk about the balance bit, sort of within my own little section in warships, that kind of reminds me of how in the Age of Sail you could have a ship that was reputed under one captain to be an absolutely superb sailor and could outmaneuver and outspeed almost everything else in its class, and then under the next captain it became just a wallowing pig, and it would often be very minor things such as where you stored all the fresh water, and that little change in where the ballast's gravity was completely changed the sailing quality of the ship, even though to an outside observer it would seem that nothing had actually become any different.
Oh yeah, it's fascinating.
Okay, so as we alluded to in the introduction, the A6M, most commonly known as the Zero, some people call it the Zeke or Zeke. I've also heard. I don't know, but maybe there was some kind of Japanese name for it as well. So what was it actually called?
Oh boy. Okay, well, strap yourselves in. So, the Japanese, and I mean, this is nowhere near as bad as the engine designation systems, which to this day I haven't sat down to sort out because I, you know, I want to vacuum the house or do dishes or anything else. But um, so for aircraft specifically, let's get the simple ones out of the way first. So the Allied code name for the Zero was Zeke. However, the Allies would also refer to it as Zero in wartime reports. They'd use the two terms interchangeably. It was actually the only Japanese aircraft that I guess you could say shared the honor of both Japanese and the Western Allies referring to it as the same thing. Don't want to read into that too much, but I think it maybe indicates a certain level of respect for the fighter that they didn't give other Allied or other Japanese aircraft. It also probably makes sense because Zero just that where they ended up drawing it from is just a snappy, easy name to say in either language. So
Yeah.
the Japanese often referred to it informally as Reisen, Zero Fighter. Um, Now, official designations start to get messy. They come into existence at different times, and they're of varying degrees of usefulness, in my opinion. I'll explain the two most relevant and why I prefer one over the other. So the first is the type system. This system is relatively straightforward, at least for our purposes. The Zero was designated Type Zero Carrier Fighter. The number comes from the last two digits of the year it entered service, in this case 1940. For those of you who are like, what, last two digits? Why isn't it Type 40? Well, it's because at that time, the Imperial Japanese calendar, it was the year 2600. Um, that's kind of that's based on the mythical founding date of the Imperial Royal household.
Oh, okay.
Of course, they dropped one digit because it was redundant in this case. Although I have seen written records from the Allies and such, which did say Type 00. Um, Think of that as what you will.
Okay.
I personally don't dislike the type system as it's prone to a lot of confusion. One amusing case I actually found that's also historical is My main stomping grounds are interwar U.S. intelligence assessments of the Japanese. And one report I found where the poor naval attaché that put it together, he understandably confused features from the Type 99 carrier bomber, the Type 99 light bomber, and the Type 99 twin engine light bomber. And then it ended up coming out the other side as this weird fictional Type 99 bomber, Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster, that I should say.
Yeah.
And I just chuckled, and I'm like, I feel you, bro. Um, but uh, officially, the type system is where the two-number modification system was also attached. So, for example, for the famous carrier fighter in 1942, the Model 21, so it's Type 0, carrier fighter, Model 21. The model number is rendered and pronounced in English as 21 in this case. However, it is actually 2-1. The first number indicates changes to the airframe, and the second indicates changes to the power plant. So in this particular case, one change was made to the airframe over the preceding Model 11, the addition of folding wingtips. No changes were made to the power plant, so that stayed at 1. That might open some eyes for people that are more used to looking at model numbers, because they bounce all over the place seemingly at random, and it's because it is actually broken down in that way.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense because I suppose, yeah, I mean, for me, I'm used as a British person, I'm used to seeing like Spitfire Mark 1, Spitfire Mark 2, etc., logically progressing up the chain, and I suppose you've got like F4, F1, F4, F2, F4, F3, or
Mhm.
likewise, or P51 A, B, C, D. So I suppose, so yeah, if to an outside observer, if you're looking at and it's sort of A6M to Model 11, you might think, oh, that's equivalent to Mark 11. There must be a whole bunch of discarded variants before that, but actually that represents the first model.
Yeah, the first production model. That's why you go from 11 to 21 to 32 back to 22, for example.
Oh dear.
So to add further confusion, before 1942, a different modification system was used for the type designation, where a mark number was placed between the type number and aircraft type to denote large modifications, and then a model number was placed at the end to denote minor modifications. So, for example, Type 0, Mark 1, Carrier Fighter, Model 2. You don't see that rendering very often. Even the Japanese don't like it.
Yeah, you can vaguely understand the concept behind the Model 2.1 or Model 1.1, etc., but
Mhm.
that's just what?
Yeah, that it gets confusing. Thankfully, there's another designation system that I honestly prefer. That is the short designation system. It's actually quite similar to the U.S. Navy's system designation.
Mhm.
It's my preferred method for Japanese Navy aircraft because you can identify the plane right down to the sub variant with relatively few syllables, and you're not going to be as confusing people as much. So the zeros designation under the system, commonly rendered in English anyway, is Mitsubishi A6M. For reasons I'll get to in just a second here, Mitsubishi is kind of redundant in that instance. So to fully break down the system, I have to get more specific. And again, I'll use the workhorse 0 through 1942 as my example. And I've also added the model number to the end, which is commonly done in English because it makes things extra clear. Keep in mind, this was not used in the official short designation system. The model system was for type, and the short designation system stood on its own. I'm combining the two because otherwise it gets very confusing. Um, anyway, so for this, I'll break down A6M2 Model 21. So the first letter indicates aircraft type. A is the code for carrier fighter. The first number indicates the number of aircraft under that type. So in this case, 6 is the sixth carrier fighter ordered by the Navy. The second letter indicates the company that designed the aircraft, in this case, M for Mitsubishi. And the second number indicates the major variant or model. So 2 is the second major variant of the A6M1, or sorry, of the A6M. A6M1 being the preceding one, and that was the prototype that was re-engined. So they deemed that change large enough that they got a new major variant model attached to it. And then the model number I stick on the end is as I explained
Yeah.
above, and it's just there for clarity. The other main part of the short designation system was a designator for minor modifications. These were indicated by a lowercase letter A, B, C, etc. So, for example, the A6M3A That particular subvariant of the Zero had a new type of cannon installed. Again, I would personally say A6M3A Model 22 just to make it clear what I'm talking about, but that isn't official. Now that everyone listening is thoroughly confused and praying for death, we can proceed.
Indeed. Fair enough. Yes. Maybe that should be a special sentence for people who displease me on my channel. I can put them in a room that's just labeled Japanese aircraft designation decoding.
And then there's a special ninth level for aero engine designations.
Yes. Okay, so obviously we discussed where the aircrafts come from, when it's come into service, and what we're actually calling the blasted thing. So it obviously sees its sort of main, although it's in combat with against the Chinese and such beforehand, its main claim to fame, I suppose, is its performance in the Pacific conflict against America, and then later on the rest of the Allies. So, how did the A6M A6M2, I guess, actually compare with the other naval aircraft of 1942 that it was running into? Did it have any particular strengths or weaknesses compared to its opponents at that time?
Mhm. So first off, I'll explain how I'm going to handle this for the purposes of this chat. I'm not going to start opening the can of worms of listing endless flight characteristics, or else we'll be here for the next 8 hours, and then trying to rectify discrepancies between sources, and then juggling dozens of factors that impact performance. It's really not a simple thing to do, and it must be handled very carefully. Since this discussion is broader in scope, it's kind of meant to be a basic introduction. I'll predominantly couch things in relative terms. Tends to be more helpful for understanding anyway. So to drive this point that I'm trying to make home a little bit, I want to quote an opening from a fighter comparison work that I have just to indicate even a little bit of what I mean. So quote, stating that airplane B had a maximum speed of 345 miles per hour at 14,500 feet, while airplane A could obtain 380 miles per hour at 21,500 feet, tells the reader nothing. How fast were they at 16,000 feet, or 5,000 feet, or 30,000 feet, i.e., at the same flight condition? Which had the better climb rate at 5,000 feet? What were the rates of turn at sea level? At what speed did they stall with their flaps up at 15,000 feet at combat weight? At 10,000 feet? How about at any altitude the reader is interested in? End quote. Et cetera, et cetera. The gist is that this kind of discussion is a rabbit hole. We haven't even talked about context, which honestly is by far more important than technical characteristics. So with all that aside, let's move into this. So I'm not going to bother comparing the F2A or the F4, F3 or British stuff just for the sake of time. This chat's already going to be at least 2 hours. Let's focus on the classic struggle between the F4, F4 and the A6M2 Model 21. So first off, the Zero had an all-around vision canopy, which was relatively novel actually for when it was introduced, and it certainly gave it an advantage over the F4, F4, which had poor rearward visibility, particularly after they added the armor plate, or the F4, F4 had the armor plate standard. That being said, I don't want to overemphasize it too much. It's just a minor little thing that often people don't think about. The Zero was faster than the F4, F4 at all altitudes. They were closer matched, at least at sea level. But higher than that, the Zero had a pretty pronounced advantage. This was made more pronounced because the Zero had far better acceleration than an F4, F4, which obviously worked into American pilot impressions of the relative speeds of the aircraft. So even if at a given altitude their speeds were closer, if they were both at the same energy state and accelerating, the Zero would pull away way faster than an F4, F4, which would give American pilots this impression that the Zero is just going way, way faster than an F4, F4, even though that's not necessarily the case given specific altitude.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're going to discuss a little bit more about that further on, but that is in a particularly interesting point because when I was growing up and listening to sort of early opinion formed about the Zero, there was a constant undercurrent of people characterizing the Zero as extremely maneuverable but slow compared to superior Allied aircraft, and obviously in 1942 that's not actually the case.
Yeah, so in this specific instance, it's actually not. We'll get to the point of the Zeros, specifically the A6M2 speed, a little later on, because that's a mess. But yeah, there is at least truth to the Zero being faster, at least compared to certain aircraft it was fighting.
Yeah.
The Zero blew the F4, F4 out of the water when it came to operational range, and then it's just running up the scoreboard when you consider the F4 F4 wouldn't actually get drop tanks until the later part of 1942. That was a major complaint leveled against the F4F4 by pilots. It complicated air operations greatly, and it limited the F4F4's offensive punch. And of course, it reduced the amount of time it could loiter over the fleet, which is another kind of unsaid factor when it's not just about striking range, it's also about how long a plane can loiter, which, of course, for a fighter tasked with defending a fleet is a very useful trait to have. The Zero's rate of climb was significantly better than an F4F4, which also made the Zero excellent in vertical maneuvers and zoom climbs, something they exploited constantly. The F4F4's poor climb rate was another common complaint among pilots. It hindered its ability to react to incoming threats at higher altitudes because it just was not a good interceptor. That is why early warning provided by, for example, coast watchers and radar during the Guadalcanal campaign was absolutely decisive. The early warning given to the F4F4s gave them just enough time to climb up above the Japanese before they arrived, which mitigated one of the main disadvantages of the aircraft. Without early warning, the war in the air over over Guadalcanal would have been gone very differently. So to give a rough time frame, for example, they'd usually get roughly 40 minutes early warning if everything was going according to plan of a Japanese attack. And that was almost the exact amount of time that they needed to climb all the way up to, I think it was about 30,000 feet, is what they would aim for to guarantee an energy superiority over the incoming Japanese. The Zero's low-speed maneuverability was superior, of course. That's probably its most famous trait. It was a poor gunnery platform at high speeds, however. Because their flight controls began to lose their responsiveness, particularly in roll. So above 289 kilometers an hour, which is pretty slow, aileron control would start to stiffen. And then at 370 kilometers an hour, which is still relatively slow, the aircraft became difficult to roll. And that was a major complaint among Zero pilots, and it would be one of the focuses of improvement on the next model of Zero, the A6M3, Model 32. The F4F4 could dive faster than the Zero. The one thing to note is that the Zero could stay with it for a short period at the start of a dive. The amount of time it could stay with an F4F4 depended on how steep the Wildcat was diving. This is a similar story with all Allied aircraft, as it was found that pilots thought they were diving steeper than they actually were. The Zero could stay in firing range for an extended period of time in those cases. That is why, as the war progressed, kind of the standard evasive maneuver for the Allied pilots gradually became a spiraling dive, which forced the Zero to not only dive, but also try to roll at high speeds, which were, that's the two things that the Zero was bad at doing. So it pretty much guaranteed that you would be able to escape. The generally better dive performance of heavy American aircraft was, of course, famously exploited time and time again to escape unfavorable engagements. And this was paired with the F4F's trait that it was actually a pretty good gunnery platform at high speeds. It maintained its responsiveness, which made it well suited for hit and run attacks as long as it had an energy advantage over its opponent. And when I say energy, I mean the combination of kinetic and potential energy, which is just airspeed and altitude. So you'll see a lot of discussion of energy advantage or disadvantage when you're talking about air combat, and that's all they're talking about. It's kind of like having the high ground, I guess, in a land engagement, for example.
Yeah.
Or having the weather gauge, I guess, for the
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, bring it back around to the nautical. The armament of the two aircraft was quite different. Neither was poor, but the uniform armament of the 50 calibers was definitely superior, in my opinion, in fighter-on-fighter combat. And that is when they weren't jamming, which was actually a recurring problem in the F4F4 that took a little while to iron out. It was something, the guns themselves were extremely reliable, but it was something to do with how they were actually mounted in the wings.
Okay.
We'll talk about the Zero's armament a little later on in its own section.
Mm-hmm.
The F4F4 could absorb more punishment than the Zero, very famously. Again, we'll get to the question of the Zero's durability a little later. Overall, in my opinion, and I think it's pretty safe to say the academic consensus, the two aircraft were closer matched than the popular conception. The Zero had more on-paper advantages when you look at just characteristics in a spreadsheet, but it wasn't decisive, and the air campaigns reflected this reality, with losses matching up very closely. At times, the F4Fs would come off better, and at times the Zeros would. In the great fight for Guadalcanal, for example, the battles were very seesaw. The winner in an individual engagement had almost always been the side that started with the altitude advantage. As I said, context matters a lot.
Yeah, and I suppose that plays into, as you said earlier, about the air early warning available at Guadalcanal, which meant that the Allies had more chance to have that advantage.
Mhm.
Um, okay, well, obviously, yeah, with getting on to some of the more specifics, bearing in mind everything that's just been said, one thing I have seen floating around about the Zero quite often is the claim that Japanese pilots would prefer a close-in turning dogfight, whereas US Navy pilots would prefer to sort of boom and zoom from altitude onto their enemies, and that the Zero was incapable of sort of matching that. Now, is that actually true? And almost regardless of whether or not it is, what were the tactics that the A6M pilots did actually use, and how effective were they when they were used against Allied aircraft?
Yeah, so this is a great question because this is obviously one of the most famous dichotomies I can think of for World War II air combat. So, of course, US tactics are very well known, so I'm not going to waste any time there, but I'm going to drill down on Japanese Navy fighter tactics specifically a little bit. So the dog fighting and tail chasing Japanese, it's a very common line. You'll see that a lot in books. Will have some variation on that claim, and many of those books are actually excellent histories. However, this is not really the case when you look at the aerial engagements in detail. And I'm not the first person to point this out. That goes, at least in English, to John Lundstrom, whose two books on the Pacific Naval Air War from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal are superlative and authoritative. I cannot recommend those two books more for anyone that's interested in this era, period of air combat, specifically the naval air combat. And nor is he alone. With more and more works focused on Japanese naval aviation and using Japanese sources, they're kind of coming to the same conclusion, even if they're not aiming at it. So even if the point of the book isn't to prove such and such tactically speaking, they're proving it just by describing in detail their examples of air combat. And I've
Okay.
accidentally stumbled across this in my own research as well, which kind of like raised my eyebrows when I first saw it because I always had that impression in my mind. And it really just confirms Lundstrom's astute observations that he made in his two books. And out of anything in this chat, it'll probably come as the biggest shock to people. And that is the Japanese Navy Air Service pilots had the same emphasis on hit and run attacks that their US Navy counterparts did. And it becomes obvious very quickly if you look at details. But it can be missed easily if you're skimming over them, and that is why I suspect it's kind of still misrepresented in a lot of the literature, is most of the historians that have looked at this subject have been focused on other things. The naval battle, the land battle, the overall campaign, etc. So the descriptions of air combat tend to be vague. They just kind of throw in a lot of descriptors there about agile zeros and nimble zeros and the zeros attacked, but there's no detail or enough depth for you to convey what the zeros are actually doing. Um, Much is made of Allied training and information bulletins to avoid dogfighting with zeros, and those did exist. But they seem to assume that is proof that the Japanese Navy pilots wanted to always dogfight. Just as there's an assumption that just because the Zero was a good dogfighter, that was the default mode for Japanese Navy pilots. And as far as I can determine, the evidence just isn't there to support that line of argument. Did dogfights happen? Well, yeah. They happened everywhere. They happened in Europe. They happened in Asia. They happened in anywhere you can think of. Just depending on the context, a dogfight could break out and often did. It wasn't just all hit and run all the time for any side. For example, if you had insufficient energy to do a hit and run, so in other words, the targets you need to attack are moving about as quickly and are at about the same altitude as you, there's no real opportunity for you to hit and run other than maybe make a head-on firing pass and then try to run away that way, which is not ideal. Or you could just opt to accept a dogfight for any number of reasons. And sometimes just the preferred tactics of both sides, they'd break down and they would just get stuck in. It just happened. Now, the Zeros and the pilots that flew them were good at dogfighting, so the Allied powers were right to tell their pilots to specifically avoid dogfights, because otherwise, without that information, they might just accept a dogfight, because, again, that's just the nature of air combat. That being said, hit and run energy fighting, as we would call it, was the preferred tactic for both sides. And please note, I'm being specific to the Japanese Navy Air Service here. The Japanese Army Air Service, I would say, is a lot more stereotypical. They would start to shift their tactics in this direction as well, but it took them well into the Asia Pacific War to do so. Their preoccupation with close in dogfighting during the early part of the war is very evident. So, in other words, when you look at vivid descriptions of Japanese Army Air Service combat, they are flipping around and trying to turn fight everything outside of one experimental unit using Key 44s. But generally speaking, they were all emphasizing on turn fighting, whereas in contrast, the Navy had been using hit and run fighter tactics since the war in China, of which we have numerous vivid descriptions.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that it's interesting you mentioned about the telling Allied pilots to avoid the dogfights for the reasons you specify, because that plays into, I don't know if we're going to talk about it a little bit later on, but it does play into one of the more famous encounters with the against the Australian Spitfires over Darwin,
Mm-hmm.
where on paper the Spitfire Mark V is technically, I think, is more agile than the Zeros that it faces off against, but in practice, it all devolves down into a horribly messy dogfight, and the Zeros dominate.
Mm-hmm.
And the only pilot pretty much on the Australian side who actually shows off what the Spitfire 5 was capable of doing is the one guy who's actually experienced and
Mm-hmm.
has a combat record, but everyone else who isn't quite up to speed on that gets taken apart by the Japanese pilots, who, as you say, they're actually trained for that.
Mm-hmm. So I guess to go through some examples here, because I'm sure there's probably some people already doubting and slamming their keyboards right now. So first off, the Americans were not the first to use hit and run fighter tactics against the Japanese. You kind of get this perception in the English literature that Chenault was the brilliant super genius that invented it. Um, Actually, that was Soviet volunteers. Well, I should say, quote, volunteers that had been sent to China from 1937. There was actually a significant Soviet air presence in China from 1937. And they developed such tactics and used them against the Japanese air services. In fact, it's actually almost creepy how similar their learning curve is to the Western Allies, in that they start out, they're far more willing to accept dogfights, and then I'm reading U.S. intelligence reports that are conveying what's happening to the Soviets, and they're like, I have a report that literally the entire gist of the report is Soviet volunteers have been specifically told to stop dogfighting with Japanese pilots, um, and instead to use hit and run. Um, Now, initially, as the fighting first starts in China, dogfighting was very prevalent, and even among the Japanese Navy Air Service. However, you start to notice a transition away from it pretty quickly. And I'll give you a couple examples. I mean, I'm not going to list every single example or be here all day, but in January 1938, Japanese Navy pilots actually used hit and run tactics during a fighter sweep over Nanchang. So several Chinese and Soviet pilots, they were climbing and they were attacked by A5Ms that dove out of the clouds. And it uh, really to emphasize this, the A5M is a way better dogfighter than a Zero. So they dive in from above. After the A5M made their firing passes, they moved out ahead and zoom climbed back up to altitude. This was repeated throughout the engagement, and eventually 3 I-16s were shot down. At no point did they start chasing tails or needlessly wasting their energy to turn fight, even though in this case, the A5M could easily win a turn fight against an I-16, but they opted to use hit and run tactics. They never turned. Again, in August 1938, A5Ms took turns making high-speed diving passes on a Chinese pilot's Gloucester Gladiator before zoom climbing back up out of reach. Japanese Navy fighter tactics that emphasized hit and run and energy fighting were actually so common that they introduced some confusion into Allied intelligence reports. And that's where my research comes into things, because my first introduction was through the lens of American intelligence. So some American intelligence reports actually assumed that these tactics that they were observing indicated the Zero lacked maneuverability. So here are a couple quotes from a July 1941 US intel report on Japanese Navy fighter tactics in China. Quote, According to Chinese reports, and judging by from their apparently long fuselage, these planes, referring to the Zero here, do not have a small turning circle and are not very maneuverable. End quote. The Chinese reports in question noted the reluctance of Japanese Navy pilots to dogfight. And this is also corroborated by the account of a captured Japanese bomber air crewman who vividly describes what we would call, I guess, boom and zoom or energy fighting in the vertical. Literally word for word is how I would define it, and that's what he described as standard Japanese fighter tactics to the interrogators. So to continue this report, quote, Chinese pilots report that the Japanese will not engage in a turning duel, but like to make a diving attack and then a steep climb. The Chinese Russian-designed planes cannot follow in a climb, and if they fall off or when the Japanese otherwise gets a good altitude advantage, he kicks his plane over and dives again on the Chinese plane, which may be nearly stalled. The Chinese find the enemy's zooming tactics hard to neutralize, end quote. Another report from April 1940, so this is before the combat debut of the Zero, stated that, quote, Japanese fighters always approached an enemy formation in open echelon of sections, always with an altitude advantage, end quote. Collectively, the Japanese pilots kind of referred to their tactics as the Chongqing method, which is the gist is don't attack without some kind of advantage in altitude or numerical or both. Formation discipline also improved through the China incident. Early on, formations would often break up and it would just become a wild free-for-all. However, that became less frequent as the scale of the air war increased because more planes forced better coordination. And the Japanese continued to gain experience through the conflict. And then this was cemented in the immediate lead up to December 7th, 1941, with intensive formation training. They specifically focused on the Shotai and Jutai level, which we'll get to in a second. So moving into the war proper against the Allies, accounts of Japanese hit-and-run fighter tactics against the Allies are so numerous, we'd be here for days if I go through them, because these are standard tactics.
Fair enough.
One American pilot commented after action report against Japanese Zeros on September 27th, 1942, that in his opinion they had, quote, generally poor fighter tactics, end quote. Why? Well, his reason was, quote, Zeros could not be shaken by us if they would chop their throttle and sit on our tails, end quote. In other words, the American pilot was criticizing the Japanese for not being willing to dogfight enough. Now, I don't agree with his assessment that that was poor tactics. Hit and run on energy fighting was just the way aerial tactics had moved around the world. You didn't want to dogfight all the time, but it very clearly indicates that the Japanese Navy pilots were not just chasing tails when even the Americans are like, maybe these guys could actually dogfight more. I'll give you just a couple examples here. One, I'll actually pick one for the Royal Australian Air Force just because I can. So on May 2nd, 1942, 3 RAF Kitty Hawks and 7 Airacobras attempted to intercept some Tainan Kokutai Zeros, and the Zeros spotted the incoming flight. They climbed up above them, formed into echelon as a Chutai, which is a 9-plane formation of 3 Shotai, though in this case there was actually only 8 Zeros because one had mechanical issues and couldn't take off. And then they proceeded to make high-speed hit-and-run firing passes on them. So we're starting to see a pattern here.
Yes.
For my second and last example, I will read a vivid description of one of the most famous aerial engagements of the war from Lundstrom's The First Team Pacific Naval Air Combat from Pearl Harbor to Midway. And that is Jimmy Thach's division of VF-3 against a massive amount of Kido Butai's combat air patrol at the Battle of Midway. I'm not going to read it all because his description goes on for about 10 pages, I think, which kind of illustrates my point, is think of this engagement in other books on the Battle of Midway. You might get a few paragraphs if you're lucky. There isn't a lot of vivid detail as far as the tactics being employed. They're just saying the Zeros attacked. They're talking more about Thach weave and everything. And I think that this will bear out why some of these misconceptions have persisted for so long. And I'll also note a couple of other interesting points in the narrative here. But I think this is really an excellent example of Japanese naval fighter tactics. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So at this point, the one Wildcat that will be shot down has already been shot down. The first Zero to scream in from above singled out Macomber's Wildcat as its target in a high rear attack. Its gunnery was excellent. From behind his seat, Macomber heard loud noises as 7.7 rounds zipped through his plane's empennage and bounced off the armor plate back of the cockpit. Bullets knocked out his radio and penetrated his aluminium emergency fuel tank, but fortunately F6's controls remained intact. And the tank was empty, purged with carbon dioxide. Confronted with overwhelming fighter opposition, Thatch at first thought to nose down, gain speed, and support the torpedo planes. The Swifter Zeros never gave him the chance. By the time F4Fs had descended to 3,000 feet, the Japanese brought them to bay by means of relentless individual high-speed hit-and-run firing passes. Thatch had to break off and maneuver defensively or be shot down. The combat quickly assumed a deadly pattern. Diving in one at a time, each Japanese closed within firing range, opened up with intermittent bursts, then roared past the F4F4s in order to recover below and ahead. A swift zoom climb then brought the Zero out of reach and back up above in position to make another run when its turn came. Thatch was most impressed with the skill and coordination on the part of his opponents. Essentially, there was a Zero making its run on him at all times. Thatch later estimated the interval between successive zeros to be 20 to 30 seconds. Only very rarely did the Japanese attempt any kind of attack other than above rear, and this combat refutes criticisms that the Japanese were only tail-chasing dogfighters. Under pressure, the three VF-3 pilots slid into a near line of stern formation with the trailing plane a step down behind the leader. Thatch instinctively knew the best chance for survival lay in maintaining formation and countering each attack. He was too low to dive away and escape, and the pack of Mitsubishis above wanted nothing more than to see the F4F split up and run. Thatch's first defensive maneuver was to lead the division into a sharp turn away from the attacker. After he saw the Zero come in at the full moment committed to its run, the turnaway presented the attacker only a full deflection shot, and for a Zero in a high-speed dive, it was difficult to draw a lead. Again, Zero poor as a high-speed gunnery platform. Thatch's timing had to be just right to disrupt his opponent's aim. As his trailer, Macomber most often was the target. He watched as each Zero successively slid into its run, moving with deadly grace. Then he called Thatch on his dead radio, not realizing it was functioning. As the Japanese flashed into shooting range, Macomber would jink up and down from side to side. The line of stern formation permitted some independent maneuvering without risk of collision. Macomber soon discovered that a short, sharp pushover seemed to disconcert the Japanese the most, since they were holding positive G and making their runs and could not easily and smoothly adjust their point of aim downward. Again, more indications of when you're making high-speed diving passes with the Zero, it's not ideal. Thatch timed his turn away about the same time Macomber would begin jinking. All this depended on where the Zero was in its run. Gibb and Macomber stuck behind Thatch in his turns and let him direct all counter moves. And it keeps going on and on and on. However, one very interesting point at the end here is that basically each Zero, they'd keep making their hit and run firing passes, and all Thatch could do is evade and then make a quick snapshot, and usually they were already up and out of range. However, in fact, the first of his 3 kills of the day makes what I almost want to call the mistake, as in probably the most common mistake made by a Japanese naval fighter pilot was after making the firing pass, they would pull up into the zoom climb too quickly, which brought them up right in front of the Wildcat, and that's what Jimmy Thatch, in this case for the first kill, abuses, because the Zero pulls up right in front of his gun sights at close range, and he shoots it down. So that's a pretty vivid description of these kinds of fighter tactics, and again, in one of the most famous engagements of the war. Now, for the sake of time, we won't get into tactical organization in much detail. Very briefly, the basic Japanese tactical formation for their fighters until the end of 1943 was the 3-plane Shotai. You will sometimes see it described as a copy of the British Vic, but that's incorrect. The Shotai started that way, but was significantly reformed due to combat experience in China from 1937. And then by December 1941, it was really its own formation. It was far more flexible, rarely entered combat in a V formation, instead of adopting left or right echelon or line of stern, depending on the tactical situation, and it proved highly effective. A Chutai was the other formation that had significance at the tactical level, and that generally consisted of 3 Shotais for a total of 9 planes, at least on paper. Theoretically, there were a lot of complicated maneuvers that could be conducted by a Chutai, but really, it only often maintained cohesion at the start of an engagement. And if the engagement devolved into a dogfight, the component show tie would tend to operate independently. Um, the show tie, even with the reforms to make it more flexible, was inferior to what would be called finger four or schwarm formation. The Japanese Navy would eventually move toward adopting a finger four plane formation consisting of two pairs working together. That would become the standard by the end of 1943. I could go into way more detail, but we'll just leave discussions of formations there. The gist is that the Japanese Navy fighter tactics, as they had matured by December 1941, they worked well and bore much similarity to the US Navy when it came to hit and run energy fighting and deflection shooting. The U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps were the only two air services to extensively train their pilots in making full deflection shots years before the war. And what I mean by a deflection shot is really just approaching a target from any angle that isn't directly astern or directly ahead. So you have to lead the target.
Yeah.
Most air forces like USAF, Luftwaffe, RAF, Japanese Army Air Service, they focus predominantly on setting up zero deflection shots, so directly astern or in front. Keep in mind that doesn't mean nobody in those services did deflection shots. There just wasn't a lot of extensive training in making full deflection shooting. That was just pretty much unique to the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. Navy Air Service actually did a little bit of training on full deflection shooting, but nowhere near as extensively. And arguably, that was a more important advantage than hit and run tactics. At least that's what Lundstrom argues. Because the
Yeah.
ability for U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps pilots to consistently hit aircraft at full deflection was a huge advantage.
Yeah, well, I suppose if you're trained mainly to sit on somebody's tail, you've got to get there. Whereas if you're trained at deflection shooting, that opens up you to fire on an enemy at an awful lot more angles.
Mm-hmm. To get specific for the Japanese Navy fighter pilots, they preferred high side runs with the deflection shots up to 30 degrees, though, as we see, they generally opted for lower deflection than that. High side runs were also optimal for building up enough airspeed to pull out ahead and under the target, and then after the gunnery run, and then zoom climb back up to altitude. Sound familiar? The
Yep.
main mistake made by Zero pilots was not to tail chase or attempt to dogfight, but again to pull up into their zoom climb too quickly after a firing pass. That gave Allied pilots a chance to counterpunch, and then thanks to the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks and armor, that simple mistake would often be a Zero pilot's last. One thing I have to mention is the Hineri Komi, because it's going to come up if I don't. It was an air combat maneuver that originated in Japan in 1934. There's some implication in some literature that it was like some kind of foundational maneuver, but really it was only a defensive counter move used to turn the tables on an opponent approaching from the rear, and that's it. It was a novel maneuver that worked exceptionally well if an opponent was baited into following the Japanese pilot into the initial loop. But even if they didn't fall for the bait, it acted as an evasive maneuver. Yeah, the Japanese pilot didn't get the satisfaction of fully turning the tables, but they might live through that firing pass because really the enemy pilot had two choices. You either follow them into the maneuver and then have a zero on top of you, or you allow the Japanese plane to evade and then you follow through on your attack and recover and try to attack again. Again, the Hineri Komi was not as defensive. It wasn't the be-all, end-all of Japanese fighter tactics. Nicholas Millman's description of the maneuver is the best I've seen, and it is as follows, quote, "The term Hineri Komi has been translated as turning in and involved turning the tables on a pursuing attacker by a sharp, almost vertical climb to begin a loop, and then near the top, briefly applying right aileron and hard left rudder to side slip out of the loop and snap roll quickly in a twisting motion to put the zero behind and above the attacking aircraft as it attempted to follow through." Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So, well, I mean, that's a lot more detail on how a zero dogfights than to be honest, I've read anywhere. Albeit obviously, yeah, most of the time is in with what I'm mainly interested in. I'm mainly interested in how many zeros a ship could carry, not so much what they did once they're up. So, it's above sea level, whatever. It'll come down eventually. But no, it's very useful because say that's kind of basic. Oh yeah, the Japanese always love to dogfight, and the superior Allied aircraft could just speed past them is a very common trope, but obviously is far from the truth. Now we mentioned within that the self-sealing fuel tank issue, which is the one of, if not the other major criticism of the Zero, along with lesser things like there's some claims that had weak armament, the slow speed we've already talked about, and also overall fragility. So, in terms of those kinds of criticisms, how true are some of them? Obviously, we've talked about the speed a bit, but I guess we'll explore them all now.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I'll go into break down pretty much every major criticism. Every one of them has at least elements of truth to it, as I think you'll often see in any kind of stereotype or trope. Some have more truth than others, but I guess we'll start with speed.
Hmm.
Um, so the Zero was kind of middle of the pack when it came to speed for July 1940, and then it would remain there through its heyday in 1942. That's the general gist. Speed, like any flight characteristic, is relative. So the A6M2 is faster than almost everything it fought in the PTO through 1942, with only a couple of situational exceptions. The P-39, at least from what I can piece together, was a bit quicker at low altitude, and then the P-40 was a bit quicker at intermediate to low altitude. There's a lot of disagreement between sources regarding the actual speed of the A6M2 Model 21. Richard Dunn actually has a freely available article on J Aircraft that digs into the question a lot. The gist is that the A6M2 Model 21 speed was decent. It wasn't world beating. Sometimes you'll get the impression from documentaries or something, because they constantly say fast.
Hmm.
But it's misleading because it wasn't the fastest, nor was it really slow. It certainly was more than enough to deal with what it was engaging in the theater. Dunn ends up concluding that 555 kilometers an hour with overboost for short periods is probably correct. Um, and then critical altitude, that being the altitude that it actually reaches its maximum speed, is also disputed. Most figures I've seen around are around 4,500 meters. Francillin, another important reference work, states that the maximum speed of the A6M2 Model 21 was 533 kilometers an hour at 4,550 meters. Again, there's a lot of values out there. Anyone interested can check out Dunn's article. The Japanese official top speed numbers were almost universally at nominal power, so without overboost, which leads to a lot of confusion when people look at documents. And then throw in tests of captured aircraft that were underperforming to various degrees, in some cases dramatically so, and that's where you start to get numbers from all over the place. As you can see, discussion of even the simplest aircraft characteristics rapidly turns into a nightmare that people
Yeah.
endlessly scream about on the internet. Um,
Yeah.
just as one case, the there's I think it's Intel bulletin number 75 or something, but where they test the Akutin Zero. And then they say, for example, that the Zero was slower than the F4F at sea level, to which some Navy pilots were like, that were actually fighting Zeros in the wild, so to speak, were like, no. Uh,
Yes.
so
Does
you
not
can
compute.
see, yeah. I will also add to this because it keeps coming up on the internet. That the Saka 12 and 21, the engines for the most variants of the Zero, they did not have power loss with negative G maneuvers. I have to bring this up because it does come up. As a Japanese expert cheekily explained to me, quote, the Americans discovered the Zero's engine cut with negative Gs by improperly repairing the Akutin Zero. um, so he explained, actually, and we can actually put up a diagram as well on the video.
Yeah.
There's actually an intake control valve for the Nakajima 100 co-float carburetor, and then during 0 and negative G, the normal inlet was closed to prevent the float chamber from being overflowed, and then it would automatically open a restricted bypass, which continued to allow a nominal amount of fuel in, so there was no engine death like you would see, for example, in the Mark 1 Spitfire.
Hmm.
That's why you'll never see Japanese accounts talking about negative G cuts in the Zero or any other aircraft equipped with Sakai engines. And it's also why the Japanese like to maneuver in the vertical. For example, the Hinei Komi, which begins with a loop before inverting and then rolling out of it, isn't exactly brilliant if your engine dies when you invert. Um, and the valve would be a very simple thing for Allied mechanics to miss when they're repairing and maintaining an engine that without the help of any manuals, and they've never really seen the engine itself either.
Yeah.
So moving on to armament, this is another one that there's truth and exaggeration. So really, and since the Zero is in service for so long, it kind of changes depending on when you look at it. So Zero can be considered well armed by the standard of mid 1940. It was armed with two 7.7 millimeter MGs synchronized through the prop, and then two 20 millimeter cannon, one in each wing. Similar armament and layout to the Bf 109 E3 4 that were the latest models in German service. And keep in mind that there were still a lot of E1s in frontline service, which only had 4 rifle caliber machine guns. And it's a similar story across. I find people have this conception of like World War II aircraft as they were in 1944, where everyone has 500 cannons, and
Yeah.
really in 1940, it's a very different landscape as far as aircraft armament goes. There isn't much to say about MGs. The MGs, they're very similar to those. In fact, they're, I think, licensed produced copies of the exact same model that were in the Spitfire and Hurricane of this period.
Hmm.
It was reliable. It synchronized well. It did its job. I can mention actually the Japanese had an HE round for it, which I'm pretty sure they're the only nation in World War II to have an HE round for rifle caliber
Machine
machine
guns.
guns.
Yes.
The cannons themselves were a more interesting story. So they were licensed produced Oerlikon FFs. Yes, Oerlikon. The same cannon family that were used in the Bf 109Es, and also later on, probably more famously, the one that the US Navy and Royal Navy and everybody was sticking all over their ships.
Yeah.
This family of Oerlikons was actually the first among the first cannon designed that were light enough to fit in aircraft. And of course, being first has its advantages and disadvantages. The main advantage of being first is that you're first, and the disadvantages are you were first, so you haven't worked out all the problems. Um,
Yes.
the Type 99-1, which was used in the A6M2 and a couple of the A6M3 variants, was the FF specifically. There are 3 major criticisms associated with the cannon. The first is it was low velocity, which made it unpopular with pilots because it made deflection shooting really difficult, and the velocity of the cannon didn't match with the rifle caliber MGs. In fact, several sources I have state that the bulk of A6M2 kills came from the rifle caliber MGs, not the cannons. The second major criticism is the rate of fire was fairly low, again, making it hard to hit things. And then the third was limited ammunition capacity, only 60 rounds per gun, so for a total of 120 rounds. The first point is fairly unique to the Type 99-1 because it had a very short barrel length. But low rate of fire and ammunition capacity were actually pretty common failings of early aircraft cannons across nations. For example, the MGFF for the E3, E4, they had 60 rounds per gun. The early Hispanos, 60 rounds per gun, etc. One major upside of the Type 99-1 was that it was extremely reliable, as opposed to the early marks of the Hispano, for example, which were plagued with stoppages in early versions. And that was a problem that would persist into 1943 for the Spitfire 5s used in the defense of Darwin. The next major variant of the Zero, the A6M3, the Model 32, increased the number of rounds per gun from 60 to 100, so we're already starting to address some of these criticisms. And it would eventually end up as high as, I think, about 125 rounds per gun, so you're over doubling ammunition capacity over the course of the war.
Hmm.
From the A6M3A Model 22, a Type 99-2 cannon was introduced. It was just longer barreled. It was Oerlikon FFL with a higher muzzle velocity, and that addressed one of the main complaints against the Type 99-1, which was the low muzzle velocity. There's also a whole bunch of other small improvements. We're not even going to bother getting into that. The Zero's armament would actually increase gradually through later variants, which is probably a little bit lesser known to people. Its final versions would have two 13.2 millimeter MGs, which somewhat ironically were actually M2 Brownings chambered in 13.2 millimeter Hotchkiss. Of course, the reason why they would pick Hotchkiss is that they had a lot of that ammo sitting around because of the anti-aircraft gun.
Yeah.
And two 20 millimeter cannon, again, Type 99-2s, late marks of them. So all told, by the standard of mid-1940, the Zero was on the heavier side of armament for fighters. Fast forward to December 1941, it's pretty pedestrian, like middle of the road. And then with continual upgrades, the Zero would stay kind of firmly in the middle of the pack when it came to offensive punch. If you want to see what underarmed looks like, take a look at the Japanese Army Air Service, particularly the Key 43-1, where they thought it was an amazing improvement to put in 2 heavy machine guns, eventually over 2 rifle caliber.
Yeah, I was to say, is that's the one with the 2 rifle caliber nose-mounted machine guns? It's
Yes,
like,
yeah.
"Hello, World War One. We've taken your armament from you."
Yeah, And then, yeah, it reached the lofty heights of two heavy machine guns that synchronized terribly and had never-ending problems until they slowly worked them out. But um,
Yeah.
that's what underarmed looks like.
Yeah.
um, Perhaps the most interesting criticism you'll see is fragile structure. Um, probably most interesting when you look past armor and self-sealing fuel tanks.
Yeah.
But Allied wartime propaganda played up the alleged fragility of Japanese aircraft, also German, particularly the Zero, and often as a way to deflect as much criticism as possible from their own aircraft. Of course, relatively early on in the war, they're not doing so hot, and there's a lot of hysteria floating around about how terrible their planes are. To deflect some of that, um, they went, well, but their planes fall apart. Um,
Mhm.
so it's understandable. It's wartime. Everybody was throwing around all sorts of hyperbole. It was actually quietly dismissed in American intelligence circles after they started capturing Japanese aircraft and studying them, where they concluded their build quality was comparable with Western powers as long as they had the raw materials and labor to work with. However, some of this propaganda has stuck around to the present day, and I've read otherwise excellent and serious histories that have given the reader the impression the Zero was practically ready to fall apart. One book I read claimed that the reason a higher horsepower engine wasn't fitted, which is, by the way, factually wrong because it was re-engined 4 times, was because the airframe would fall apart due to vibrations. Again, that's a load of crap. I have no
Yeah.
idea where they even got that from. Um, the reason more powerful engines weren't fitted more often and sooner was because the Japanese had difficulty developing high horsepower engines due to a lack of resources. And then that was made even more difficult in the Zero's case because, again, not because of the strength of the airframe, but its size. So you needed a high horsepower engine that was also small. Um, and that took well into the war for those kinds of engines to start appearing in Japan. This
Yeah.
was exacerbated by overworked design teams under constant pressure from the Navy to just churn out new variants without taking the time to re-engine because they wanted the new variant now. Um,
Yeah.
Horikoshi at least claims that it would have been possible to put something out similar to the A6M8, which is the final designed version of the Zero, in the spring of 1943, if there had been a major push from the Navy and aircraft manufacturers to actually slow down and meaningfully re-engine. Instead, serious efforts at replacing the Saka 21 wouldn't occur until it was painfully obvious to everyone, and not just the aircraft designers, that the added weight of improvements demanded that they need a bigger engine. Um, and that's kind of, take that with some salt. It's just Horikoshi's claim.
Yeah.
But you could at least see why, where kind of this misconception that they just couldn't re-engine the Zero, even though they do eventually, just way too late to matter.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, back to the Zero's structure. First, I'll categorically say that the Zero was a modern all-metal monoplane fighter with stretched aluminium skin. You think I wouldn't have to say that, but as recently as last year, I have seen people unironically saying it was made of paper and wood, and I really wish I was kidding.
Yeah. I've seen that a few times.
Yeah. Um, As one fighter comparison work I have states, the Zero, quote, was supposed to fall apart in violent maneuvers or in a dive or when its wing cannon fired. The Zero were also supposed to disintegrate when hit by machine gun or cannon fire. And now this next part is actually underlined in the work. There is no truth whatsoever in any of these statements, end quote. So let's dive a little deeper. So Richard Dunn actually compared the skin thicknesses of the Zero with early P40, and they were in the same range. Some parts of the P40 were thinner than the Zero, others were thicker, but nothing that really mattered. Even the B-24 has skin thickness in the same range as the Zero. It's stretched aluminium skin. There's nothing to indicate the Zero's skin was abnormally thin or weak, and the alloys used for the skin were also chemically the same. Now let's start to get into things that actually matter. So the A6M2 Model 21 was designed and stressed up to 7 Gs normal positive load, with 8.5 Gs as ultimate. Beyond 8.5 Gs, that's when things start breaking.
Yeah.
Its normal negative G load was 3.5, and ultimate was negative 5.2. So in other words, the pilot was going to break before the plane would, because for a pilot without a G suit, even with breathing exercises, your 6 Gs is already sustaining 6 Gs is already starting to push it for falling unconscious. So there really wasn't much need to over-engineer a plane too much beyond that at this point, which is also why military aviation history actually explained to me that USAF planes were designed with the same 7G normal load in mind.
Yeah.
Horikoshi actually goes into significant detail as far as weight reduction. In short, he relaxed the safety margins on specific components in order to save all the weight he could. And now this is where people stop and they go, "Aha! He made it light, and that therefore it's going to fall apart." But then he goes on to explain in detail. So originally he'd been designing planes with a 1.8 times margin for safety, which would mean that every component would have to withstand up to 12.6 Gs if a plane was supposed to be stressed up to 7 normal positive load, which he rightly thought was just grossly inefficient without actually adding any margin for safety, because if you're pulling maneuvers in excess of 12 Gs, you have bigger problems than your plane breaking.
Yeah, you're gonna be
Um,
hosing the pilot out of these
um, and for what it's worth, I've seen literally one example of a Zero in a high-speed dive ripping its wings off. I think that was at Battle of Santa Cruz because a bunch of American pilots saw it happen.
Mhm.
And there's literally one example I can find. In fact, I'm reading a book on Philippine pursuit pilots in the Philippines, and there's already one example of a P-40, somebody in a P-40 doing the same thing. Um, so again, it's there's no pattern there either. Um, so to compare, the P-40C again was designed with 7G loads and a slightly higher ultimate than the Zero. No night and day difference, and certainly not one that actually mattered. Again, Horikoshi's weight reduction was absolutely ruthless, and it's usually fragility is always tied to weight reduction, but honestly, a lot of the weight reduction goes completely outside any matters of safety. For one example, he actually forced a member of his team to redesign a tiny component to use aluminium instead of welded steel so that they could save 75 grams in weight. Um, Compared to the P-40C again, Zero's engine was lighter, its propeller was lighter, its landing gear struts were shorter and lighter because it had a smaller prop. The tires and brakes of the Zero could be lighter because the plane was lighter overall. The armament of the Zero was lighter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's
Mhm.
all additive, and sometimes it even multiplies, as in the case of tires and brakes, because when you're making the whole plane lighter, that whole system can be lighter. So it's kind of a run-on effect. Japanese metallurgy also helped significantly reduce the weight without compromising strength, because in 1936, Dr. Isamu Agarashi of Sumitomo Metal Industry developed something called extra super duralumin, ESD, at the request of the Naval Air Arsenal. Japan was actually the first country to develop. It was an aluminium zinc magnesium alloy, and the Zero was the first plane to use it. ESD had about 25% more tensile strength and 50% more yield strength than standard super duralumin for marginally less weight. So ESD was used for the Zero's main wing spar, the heaviest part of the plane, because it could sustain the loads it needed while also being smaller and lighter compared to a standard spar. And it decreased the weight by about 30 kilograms, which is very considerable. The Allies would actually conduct chemical analysis on the Zero and then develop their own similar alloys, such as 75S, later 7075, but they wouldn't start to use it until 1943, so that's 7 years after the Japanese invented it. It's kind of a rare case, actually, of the Japanese getting a high technology one-up on the
Yeah.
Allies. Um, so then so we've been talking about how the Zero structure really isn't that fragile, but then where does it get its reputation as being a vulnerable fighter that's pretty borne out by the record? Well, the part of that reason is that it was relatively small, so there's less of it to shoot up. However, the major reasons were lack of pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. And yes, we finally arrived, like an hour and 40 minutes into the discussion. um, okay, so here we go. I'm going to lay out a little bit of context first. So I'm going to blow some minds by explaining that Japanese aircraft of the mid to late 1930s, lacking armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, was not unique. It was actually the opposite. In fact, that was the global standard. The Soviets led the way in introducing some protection to their fighters from the mid 1930s, but that was way ahead of the curve. The Germans were the first to introduce protected fuel tanks into their bombers, I think from 37, if memory serves, or 36, followed by actually the Japanese Army Air Service, which introduced rudimentary fuel tank protection on their Mitsubishi Ki-21 bombers as a direct result of combat experience in China. And they would do this before the Americans or British had actually added such protection to their own bombers. Um, the month the Zero entered frontline service, July 1940, the Luftwaffe started to consider putting armor plate in the Bf 109. That would be gradually introduced through the rest of the year. The Zero would not have the Bf 109 would not have self sealing fuel tanks until after the Battle of Britain. The Spitfire first received modest armor protection in May 1940, though priority went to the Hurricane because the Hurricane was fighting on the front line. And by modest, I mean just a thin armored headrest at this point. I think it was about 5 millimeters, if memory serves, and not even a full backplate. And then rudimentary fuel tank protection was starting to roll out, but it wasn't really self-sealing, and that was introduced from September 1940. So the same month the Zero first claimed its air-to-air victories. The U.S. was actually behind the European powers, particularly the Navy, not surprisingly because they weren't fighting. Some protection would start trickling into designs from 1939 at a pretty slow pace. By December 1941, many of the American aircraft the Japanese would fight also lacked fuel tank and pilot protection. The F-4, F-3 entered combat in the Pacific War with no armor and no fuel tank protection. Through the first few months of the war, some boilerplate steel, so not actual armor, would be added to the Wildcats in the field, and then retrofits adding self-sealing fuel tanks would also occur gradually in the opening months of the war. This caused a number of issues, including drops in performance, inaccurate fuel gauges, self-sealing fuel tank failures, etc. However, long story short, the Wildcats would have self-sealing fuel tanks and armor installed and mostly working in time for their first confrontation with the Zero at the Coral Sea in May 1942. So that's where you see, there's all this preamble, but then at the end of the day, as far as Zero versus Wildcat is concerned, the Wildcat protected, Zero not protected is correct.
Mm-hmm.
The really important thing to understand is that self-sealing fuel tanks were not a yes-no toggle option like you'll see in some games like War Thunder. It was a new technology that would gradually evolve through the mid-1930s and into the war itself. Some designs failed for a multitude of reasons. Mistakes would be made in handling and installation. Some early attempts at designing protected tanks proved ineffective because the material was too thin or was the wrong composition, et cetera, et cetera. Also, self-sealing fuel tanks and armor didn't come for free. They weighed a lot, and in the case of self-sealing fuel tanks, that also tended to reduce fuel capacity. So, of course, that led to a drop in performance, and range tended to be the biggest loser. With all that context out, we can finally get to the Zero. So, as Richard Dunn notes, and he's written the only detailed history of aircraft protection in existence, it isn't accurate to say Horikoshi sacrificed armor and fuel tank protection because that implied that they were in existence to sacrifice in the first place. When the specification was laid out in 1937, they had no prior history of doing that, and the Zero lacking such features in 1940 was not out of the ordinary, as I've illustrated. Nor was it unheard of through 1941, and in the case of the PTO into 1942. However, from mid 1942 onward, the Japanese Navy Air Service became increasingly unique in its tardy adoption of protection features. And again, note I'm specifying the Navy here. The Army Air Service already was in the process of adding protection features to their aircraft, and by the end of 1943 would generally have comparable protection to their Western counterparts. But the Navy only took baby steps during through 41, 42, 43. The H-8K flying boat had good protection. The G-4M started to receive very rudimentary protection through 1943. The J-1N also had decent protection, but beyond that, all other Navy aircraft were unprotected. There was a reluctance to add protection to the Zero through 1942-43, and that was likely due to a combination of factors. Zero was performing well in combat anyway, so why screw with a formula that was working? But perhaps most importantly, they didn't want any major range drops through 1942 and early 1943. The Model 32, the A6M3, which honestly was a far better plane than its reputation, it was panned by Japanese pilots because it lacked the range to conduct some of the operations that they were currently engaged in. So the thought of adding self-sealing fuel tanks that would drop it further was probably just not going to fly. No pun intended.
Yeah.
The Zero finally started to get protection in late 1943 with the A6M5, the Model 52. That's when it got automatic wing tank fire extinguishers. And the fire extinguishers could put out one fire if the tanks lit up, and then but the tanks themselves were not self-sealing. And then the following protection features were additive to the Zero's design. So A6M5B, mid-1944, received 45mm bulletproof windscreen. A6M5C, which also, by the way, this is the variant of the Zero that finally woke the Navy up to maybe we need to re-engine this after we've been adding so much to it.
Okay.
It received a piece of 55mm bulletproof glass for the rear of the seat of the pilot's head, and an 8mm armored plate for the seat rear. For those unfamiliar with aircraft protection, 8mm is a decent amount.
Mhm.
Um, Now the question marks set in because it's late war Japan. And big thank you to Kaz, actually, who has a lot of documentation and also can read Japanese, um, helping me out on this. So self-sealing fuselage tanks were scheduled to be adopted at the A6M5C, possibly. They were definitely adopted by the A6M6, which is the model 53. By the way, we're into 1945 now.
Yes.
Self-sealing wing tanks were scheduled to be adopted on the A6M5C, and then he doesn't even know when the Zero actually got them.
Mhm.
But the gist is that the Zero got protection too late to matter. By the time the Allies finally, by the time the Zero finally provided some protection, the air war had swung decisively in favor of the Allies.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah,
this?
so but by the time you're adding protection to an aircraft in 1945 and you're Japan, you probably have bigger things to worry about.
Yes, exactly. So, how important was the lack of protection? That can be debated to the end of time. I personally think it was very significant. When you look at the nature of a lot of the kills against Zeros, which were snapshots as the Japanese pilots pulled into their zoom climbs too quickly, it's entirely reasonable to think that with armor and fuel tank protection, far more Japanese pilots would have made it home after making that mistake. However, the counterpoint to that is the impact on the aircraft's performance. If the early variants of the Zero had protection, would the resulting drop in performance have more than offset the benefit of having the protection in the first place? So, for example, the best protected aircraft over New Guinea in 1942 was the P-39-400, but that had the highest loss rates, whereas the least protected, the Zero, had the lowest. Again, the counterpoint to that counterpoint is when the Zero was shot down, it was almost certain that the pilot died along with it, whereas quite a few P-39-400 pilots, their planes would get shot up, but then they'd bail out and live to fight another day. So there's no simple answers there, but there's a lot of moving parts to the question.
Yeah.
One criticism that I'm actually going to talk about a little bit because I think it's really important, but it gets less coverage than others, is the lack of reliable radios. Um, there was a lack of reliable radio communications in the Zero through 1942-43. And I'll get the most straightforward part out of the way first. So carrier-based Zeros, all of them had radios simply out of necessity. However, pilots didn't like to rely on them, and the lack of reliable radios undermined Japanese fleet defense, understandably. Since it was difficult and at times impossible to communicate with the Zeros that were already aloft, the cap was largely left to its own devices with only rudimentary direction from the fleet below. Like a screening ship would see an incoming attack and they'd fire their guns, or they'd shoot off a flare, or destroyers would lay smoke as an indicator to the cap that something was coming. For the most part, the Combat Air Patrol had to self-spot and then organically respond to threats that approached the fleet. That worked well sometimes, but it failed disastrously at others, most famously at Midway in 1942. Um, Often you'll see in the narrative where people just kind of skip over this. They say, oh, because of VT6, VT8, all the Zeros were low. That's actually not
Mhm.
the case. They were low and getting shot up there. What really screwed over the Japanese cap wasn't altitude, because that narrative implies that the Zeros were climbing back up to altitude. They just couldn't get there for the dive bombers. What ended up happening is just extreme target fixation. There were 42 Zeros aloft at the moment of the decisive attack, like 1020. And from what we can discern, the vast majority, if not all 42 Zeros, were currently attacking VF3, so Thatch's unit, and
Mhm.
VT3, that specific torpedo bomber formation. All 42 Zeros in one tiny little area attacking two targets. And they were pretty much, they were seemingly blind to any other threat. Um, And that's very significant, and the failure in radio communications is definitely a factor in that.
I can
Um,
imagine they're probably getting in each other's way with that kind of
yeah,
attack.
it was grossly inefficient. For example, Thatch, he describes, and he put the number at about 15 to 20 zeros. That would put it in the range of two Chutai, which seems actually reasonable. That were forming up above him in line astern to literally take turns, um, making firing passes. And as Partial and Tully note in Shattered Sword, yeah, it was grossly inefficient. You had the entire cap on one, focused on two targets. The entire other rest of the fleet is completely unprotected by zeros. I mean, on paper, the Japanese had like a sector system where the certain zeros from a certain carrier is supposed to protect a certain part of the fleet. Of course, what ended up happening in reality is they're flying around and then they see that other zeros have found something to shoot up, and they're like, let's go over there and help them shoot that thing up. So it kind of organically flowed around the fleet, and it worked okay for attacks on single vectors. But the second you had things turn up from multiple directions, you get midway.
Yeah.
Anyway, so lack of communication. Many land-based zeros that operated in the South Pacific. Lundstrom actually claims all of them, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support that because pretty much any photo you see of a land-based zero, they don't have the radio. They removed their radios outright just to save weight because they were deemed useless. And lack of communication severely limited tactical control options that could be exercised by flight commanders. That was particularly the case over Guadalcanal because there was a significant amount of cloud buildup over the Solomon Sea that degraded visibility significantly. And there were cases where two groups of zeros would be flying along, there'd be a cloud between them. One group would start getting attacked by the Americans and really needed help. The other group, even though on paper the Japanese outnumbered the Americans in the engagement, would just kind of fly on blissfully unaware that the other set of zeros was getting attacked because there was no way to radio. Um, in fact, really, I'd say the fact that Japanese Zero pilots performed as well as they did without basic radio communications is pretty impressive. But it's undeniably a major issue. So, with that part of the question out of the way, why were the radios a problem in the first place? One part of that question falls squarely in the lap of the Japanese. The other part was beyond their control. So, the radio on the A6M2, the Model 21, was actually well designed and built. However, the installation was not properly grounded or shielded against electrical interference from the engine. Particularly, the poor shielding of the Zero's dual ignition system caused severe interference. And then static charges generated by the airframe as it moved through the atmosphere made things worse. And there were few technical personnel available in the South Pacific that knew enough about radios that they could identify the problems and fix them. So that led to the simple solution of just ripping systems out of the planes. Um, which kind of begs the question of if they were being outright removed in the South Pacific, why weren't complaints about the radios that bad early on? It was always present, but they weren't taking the radios out. And this is where I actually have to defer to Trent Talenko, who really knows his stuff about this. He graciously supplied me with a giant pile of sources. He has all the receipts for this, and he gave me the gist because I'm not even going to pretend to understand everything he sent me. So the first point is that during the period of fighting in the South Pacific, it was during a solar minimum, which was worse for static with high-frequency transmission bands. The second major point was the Earth's local magnetic field in Rabaul, Guadalcanal, New Guinea theater played havoc with high-frequency radio. In short, it was the worst theater fought in World War II for high-frequency radio static. So the maximum voice radio range of a P-39 F4F over Guadalcanal was roughly 80 kilometers. When you look at numbers for example, the Luftwaffe in Europe or the Mediterranean, it was over double that. And it wasn't because they were using secret Wunderwaffe radios. It was because they were fighting in an area where there was less high-frequency radio static. And there were a lot of examples, actually, of the Allies dealing with radio reception issues during the campaigns in the South Pacific. Like, for example, the ones that always come to mind for me are actually very significant sighting reports of Japanese fleets that never actually reached American commanders. And it's very likely that this high frequency radio static was a factor. There were So there were problems for the Allies, but it was a
Hmm.
disaster for the Japanese. When terrible natural conditions in the theater were combined with the poor shielding in their radios, all a Rabaul-based Japanese Zero pilot was going to get is just varying degrees of static, unless he was really close to a powerful ground-based transmitter. Which so that now you can see why in this specific theater at this specific time, the Zero pilots were just ripping the systems out of their
So,
planes.
yeah.
Um, the Japanese eventually actually improved the shielding of their radios in the latter part of the war, but it would remain a problem through 1943. So again, similar story, I guess, to self-sealing fuel tanks is they're fixing these problems when it's too late to
To make
salvage
a
the
difference.
situation.
Yeah. I mean, it's that's a very interesting uh, set of information because, I mean, on the one hand, it's like if you think people think about the technology involved in World War II, and that's certainly for me, that's the first time I come across the idea that astrophysics play a significant part in your communications. It's like usually when you're talking about magnetic fields and solar minimums and maximums, you're usually watching Star Trek or something, and
Yeah.
not Zero pilot over the air. But I mean, I suppose that also actually again, sort of coming from the warship side of things, that possibly informs. I might have to take a further look into that because obviously, when you get things like during the in that sector, you have the obviously historical disaster that was the ABDA command,
Mhm.
but in that whole campaign and even into some of the actions in the Indian Ocean later on, when the Royal Navy got involved in a bigger way, there were a lot of issues with communications between fleets, and historically, some of that's been written off as language barriers or resentment of another nationality being in command. But there were a lot of incidents logged where signals were unclear or just flat out not received, and having to be sort of people out of communication having to call into ports, which obviously have more powerful radio transmitters, and then having to daisy chain reports to other areas that are close enough to communicate with ships that they've become separated from. So potentially that's another aspect I could look into for.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because yeah, it had never occurred to me before
Mm.
Trent actually explained it to me, and he provided all this documentation. One we could actually put up is just an image of, and it was I think done a survey by I think an Australian university or something,
Hmm.
or post war. They sorted out all the high frequency right static and then you just see this like horrible zone, like right over New Guinea and Guadalcanal and everywhere the Zeros were fighting, where they were
Yeah,
complaining chronically about their useless radios. And a
yeah,
light bulb went on. I'm like, oh, okay.
yeah. And then I suppose once you've taken your radio out, even if you move to an area where there isn't so much interference, you're
Hmm.
not going to know because you no longer have the radio.
Exactly. I think there's something more to be explored there. Is even if in another theater you would technically the radio would be more functional. I mean, still problems because of the poor shielding, but
Yeah,
that trust is broken.
yeah,
Where you kind of see dismissively in Japanese recollections, particularly Sakai Saburo, where he's like, "Yeah, we just ripped those things out because we saved 18 kilograms in weight, and we'd rather have that than than the radios."
yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Okay.
that's an interesting point.
Yeah. So with all that in mind, obviously, as you said, there are land-based Zeros, but the Zeros are also coming across land-based fighters
Hmm.
as they get into the war. So how does it compare to those? Because obviously it's a carrier fighter. We've been
Hmm.
talking a lot about facing off against the F4F, but what about the land-based stuff that it would run into?
Yeah, so I'll add a little bit of context. Again, like I think my last
Mm.
name is going to be context because I'm doing
Yes.
that a lot. Um, So, for example, flying the extreme long ranges from Rabaul to Guadalcanal at the maximum limits of even the Zero's range, and then they were bounced from above by F4 F4s, flown by pilots skilled in deflection shooting, and the Allies had an elaborate and highly capable early warning system. All of these factors gave the Zeros far more problems than the land based aviation they encountered in New Guinea and over Darwin. Never mind that Zeros also had very limited fighting time over Guadalcanal and had to engage Americans often with their drop tanks still attached. When you actually look at the Guadalcanal campaign, it's kind of all of the problems that the Luftwaffe had in the Battle of Britain, but worse. Like it just the ranges are longer, the early warning is longer. It's just a nightmare. Um, When you compare that to the New Guinea campaign, for example, the P-39. Oh, and one thing I should note is that the F4F actually maintained its performance better at altitude than the P-40 and the P-39-400, which was significant because a lot of the time the Zeros were escorting bombers at reasonably high altitudes,
Mhm.
usually higher than 20,000 feet or 6,000 meters. Um, So, as one example, in 1942 in New Guinea, 44 P-39s were lost in combat compared to 15 Zeros. That's a kill ratio, if you want to keep kill ratios, of 3-1 in favor of the Japanese. If these numbers seem low to people, again, kill claims, both sides overclaimed significantly. Air Cobras were credited with 95 Zero kills. That's a claim to kill ratio of about 6.3-1. Japanese overclaims were also similar, so they had claims into the hundreds. Again, there's a multitude of factors behind why the Japanese did as well as they did, of which technical aspects were only one. In this case, the P-39s, since their performance at altitude fell off so significantly, they were just fighting in engagements that they were constantly at a disadvantage. This would get better in the war when Allies started introducing stuff like the P-38 that was better at high altitudes, because the Zeros then lost that altitude range that they could go run to. So up high, they have problems with P-38s. Down low, they're dealing with P-39s. And that's where you can get some of that detail there. So Zeros also didn't have too much difficulty dealing with P-40s of various variants, though keep in mind that doesn't mean it was one-sided beyond the initial engagements in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, where again there was a lot of context behind beyond just aircraft technical characteristics that were lending into very one-sided kill ratios for the Zero. P-40s in the Philippines, for example, were crippled by poor early warning. I'm actually just reading in detail the chapter on a very good book on that, where yeah, they scrambled all the P-40s very early, and they're all flying around to all these phantom threats, and then they're all out of fuel. They land, and then the Zeros turn up. um, and early warning was just critical for Allied fighters through 1941-42 because they climbed really badly. That meant that if they didn't have the warning, they would be stuck low and slow while very angry Japanese just bounced them from above with impunity. With that early warning, they gained kind of equal footing, or in the case of something like Guadalcanal, a pretty decisive advantage where they would just buzz in at extremely high speed, shoot up a bunch of bombers, and they'd be dive past and just be gone, and the Zeros couldn't do anything about it. One Many of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the Zero just kind of carry over to comparisons with the land-based aircraft, with a couple of exceptions. The performance of the P-39-400 fell off significantly at higher altitudes, but then at lower altitudes, it was much more comparable to the Zero. The P-40, various variants, was faster than the A6M2 at low and medium altitudes, but again, performance started to fall off at higher altitudes, where the initiative went over to the Zero. The Zero had decisive advantages in climb, range, acceleration, and low speed maneuverability. The American planes were more durable, had better dive performance. Um, I'll take a brief moment to mention the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, famously known as the Flying Tigers, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there around them. The AVG performed very well and frankly embarrassed the Japanese Army Air Service in Burma, but it never fought Zeros. The Flying Tigers constantly stated they did, but that was just due to simple misidentification of Japanese Army Air Service. Nakajima Ki 43s and Ki 44s, those were completely different aircraft from the Zero and were also completely different from each other. I have to bring this up because there's just a lot of literature that they look at those Flying Tigers reports saying shot down Zero, engage Zero, et cetera, and then they just say, oh, well, they were fighting Zeros. Again, it stems from the unit itself habitually misidentifying every single Japanese single-engine fighter with a retractable landing gear as a Zero. And it's not limited to them either. Phantom Zeros pop up in all sorts of Allied records. I kind of think of it as the Tiger tank of the Far East, just like how the Allies saw a Tiger in every single armored engagement in Europe. There was a Zero in every dogfight in East Asia. Now, probably one of the most interesting cases is engaging the Spitfire Mark V over Darwin, because generally speaking, when you think Zero, one of the last aircraft you would think as an adversary is the Spitfire. And it provides such a great example of context. Um, so if you look at the results with just divorced from context, like you would see on like a forum, uh, 38 Spitfires were destroyed over the duration of the campaign for the loss of 5 zeros and 1 Key 43. The zero losses may have been slightly higher if you include zeros that returned and then the airframes were written off. But
Yeah.
still, it's pretty one-sided. However, there's a bajillion different reasons for this. So the first is the Spitfire Mark V struggled with a lot of engine reliability issues and then systemic 20mm Hispano failures that badly undermined their combat effectiveness. And it would only take one 20mm Hispano to fail, and you wouldn't have any cannons because if you fired the other one, it would yaw the aircraft so badly that you couldn't aim accurately. The Japanese, another point is the Japanese fighter unit, in this case the 202nd Kokutai, formerly I think the 12th Kokutai, which was the unit that first got zeros.
Hmm.
They took part in this campaign and they were way more experienced than their RAAF opponents and consistently used better tactics and teamwork. Third, the objective of the Spitfire Mark Vs was not to duel with zeros, but to shoot down bombers. And when you factor in Japanese bomber and recon aircraft losses, the kill ratio actually evens out to about 1-to-1. With, of course, aircrew losses, Japanese losing far more.
Yeah, because of the bombers having
Um,
more people on board.
yeah. And then fourth, early warning in place in defense of Darwin was less robust than that provided for Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. And then fifth, due to various mechanical issues and range limitations, many Spitfires were lost to other things, not zeros directly. There's one instance, I think, where Spitfires end up being destroyed, and it's not because the Zeros shot them down, it's because the Zeros escorted an attack, and then they started escorting back. By the way, the round one way that was about over 500 miles. Uh, the Spitfires chased them for a while, only to realize that they were going to run out of fuel, and then they ended up ditching. So that's the super short story, but that's why context is so important, because without it, you have this really juicy sounding number that you could throw in the faces of patriotic British and Australian people. Well, look how much the Spitfires sucked. Australians can't fly, blah, blah, blah. But then when you put it in context, you start to understand what a real air campaign looks like.
Yeah.
Where there's a whole bunch of factors. And really quick, the A6M2 Model 21 had better low-speed maneuverability than the
Hmm.
Spitfire Mark V, as did the A6M3 Model 32, which was less maneuverable than the Model 21. There's actually a detailed comparison with a Model 32 and a Spitfire Mark V, where they in detail evaluated the two of them, the Australians specifically.
Hmm.
Um, they found that it could also outturn the Spitfire. However, the Spitfire Mark V had superior performance above 6,000 meters. Below that, things started to even out a little bit more, but the Spitfire still had the edge on paper. Spitfire was faster, no surprise there. It dove better. Rate of climb was actually pretty close. And the Spitfire, of course, had better protection. And the Zero had better acceleration, it's lighter, and way better range. Um, so in that case, again, you look at those just the technical characteristics between the two, and you're like, well, the Spitfire should come out pretty well. Then you look at the results, and it's a one-sided thing for the Zero. And then when you put it
Yeah.
back in context, you see why you get the results that you do.
There's an awful lot of factors just beyond as you say, kind of the computer game kind of, well, this aircraft has this spec, this aircraft has this spec.
Mm-hmm.
Put two people who have probably never come in close to a cockpit in their life with keyboards and mice, and is yes, well, wondrously the mathematics wins, but factors are different when you actually have to fly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously we've talked about strengths, weaknesses, how it performed against various opposition, mainly in its heyday in 42. So at what point did the A6M start to become surpassed by its opposition? And in that vein, was there a planned successor to the A6M beyond just upgrading it constantly? And if so, when did that come into service?
Yeah, so I would argue there wasn't an exact point in time when it was surpassed. I guess you could pick a symbolic date, like the combat debut of the F6F, but I don't think it's that useful. It was kind of a gradual process as newer Allied fighters, both land-based and carrier-based, began to see service in the PTO in numbers. So some examples, of course, the Hellcat, the F4U, P-38, P-47, P-51, all various variants, Spitfire Mark 9, etc. The P-38 started to trickle into the PTO through mid-1942, but its real impact wouldn't start to be felt until 1943. Others started to appear at different times through 1943, and as late as 1944 in the case of the Spitfire Mark 9. So broadly speaking, the Zero was starting to be eclipsed by mid-1943, and I would say it was fully eclipsed by the end of that year by the latest aircraft in theater.
Hmm.
As far as the Zero's replacement goes, the Japanese started to think about it right in 1940. Um, Not surprising there, given how the A5M, A6M transition worked. They issued the 16 Shi specification. However, remember all those systemic problems that I
Yeah.
alluded to earlier in the chat? They didn't cripple the Zero's development, but they kneecapped what would become the Mitsubishi A7M, Violent Wind, or
Mm.
um, development face planted just right out of the gate because of a shortage that isn't mentioned as often as others, and that's a lack of design staff. Put simply, Mitsubishi just had too much on its plate. They literally didn't have the people available to start design work on the A7M. At that point, Horikoshi was preoccupied with improved variants of the Zero. The Mitsubishi J2M Raiden was in the works. The company as a whole was doing all sorts of stuff. So they shelved the specifications. Another factor was they judged that a small, high horsepower engine that would have been needed to fulfill the specifications was not yet practically available. So they just shelved it. The project was revived in April 1942 under new specifications. As per pretty typical design cycle, they anticipated it would take 3 years for the aircraft to reach operational units. And I bet the keen mathematicians among you can start to see the problem here.
Yeah.
Um, so the A7M1's prototype made its first flight on the 6th of May, 1944. The engine in it was underpowered. It delivered performance way below the Navy's specifications. In fact, top speed ended up being about the same as the A6M5 with a worse climb rate, and it was just canceled in August 1944. On its own, Mitsubishi mated the A7M1 prototype to a new engine as just a test plane, and it ended up performing very well and only missed the specifications by a small amount. And the Navy adopted it in June 1945. So overall, 8 A7M1 prototypes were completed, 7 were converted to A7M2s, with at least 3 finishing that conversion. Each prototype was wrecked or damaged by the end of the war. They had a nasty tendency of getting strafed by US aircraft, except for one of apparently uncertain status that just disappeared somewhere. Maybe someone has an A7M in their garage. I don't know.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Um, Mass production unit number 1 was almost completed by the end of the war, but then it was unceremoniously dumped off the port of Nagoya immediately at the end of the war. Now, 2 other single-engine fighters were put into service by the Japanese Navy Air Service during the war and saw combat, but they weren't replacements for the Zero. The hint is in the short designations, J2M and Kawanishi N1K 1J or 2J. J was the short designation for land-based fighter. They were not carrier fighters. There was apparently one prototype of an N1K4A produced again in 1945. I don't know. There's basically nothing in English, and I'm not a big prototype guy, and it's 1945, so who cares?
Yeah.
Um, as a side note, the reason why the N1K2J, for example, wasn't the J3K2 is because the design started life as a seaplane fighter, which is N designation, and then redesigned as a land-based fighter. So the Japanese stuck the J on the end after a hyphen. That's
Okay.
also why the seaplane Zero was A6M2-N for seaplane fighter.
Okay. So effectively, the Japanese Navy was it was well at first equipped with, and then later, I guess, stuck with the A6M as a carrier fighter for pretty much the entire war.
Yep. And even if the A7M in some hypothetical scenario had entered service, I think it wouldn't have fit on most of their carriers. Like I don't think the Unnu class actually could fit it. Um,
Yeah.
Taiho could, but
Well, that didn't last very long.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, that's the aircraft itself. But obviously in the Pacific War, there is also the issue of the pilots, as well as we've discussed. Actually, pilot training makes a huge difference. So, how much did the loss of the Kido Butai's skilled pilot corps affect the perception of the Zeros as the war progressed? Because obviously it's the same more slightly upgraded aircraft, but perhaps with significantly less skilled pilots, even as the Allied advantages in aircraft technology and wartime experience begin to grow.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So uniquely among the world's navies, the Japanese Navy Air Service actually had more land-based air units than carrier-based, right into the Asia-Pacific War. That's why they took up the bulk of the fight against China from 1937 to 41. It became Japan's de facto air service when it came to strategic bombing operations, and it also spearheaded most of the air operations in China until the middle of 1941, I imagine to the eternal frustration and embarrassment of the Japanese army. Um, in December 1941, the Japanese Navy Air Service had 37 land based air groups and then 10 carriers with their air complements, and that's including Hosho. So, roughly 3,500 aircrew overall. First, I'll stress that the Japanese Navy Air Service was ground down through attrition over the course of all the combat operations conducted in the first couple years of the war. There was no single moment that Japan lost their trained air crews. It was common, for example, to claim that Japan lost, quote, most of its trained air crews, end quote, at the Battle of Midway in 1942. However, they lost only 121 aircrew in that disaster, and within that, only 36 of those were as a direct result of the carriers being bombed. It's significant, but hardly backbreaking. For some contrast, the Japanese lost about 145 aircraft crew at the Battle of Santa Cruz, which they won. So you can see kind of the attritional nature already taking on its own.
Mm.
So there was no one dramatic moment or even couple of moments that just deprived the Japanese Navy Air Service of its air crews. It was a drawn out process. Every air crewman that was killed from the start of the war through 1944 gradually degraded combat effectiveness. The impact of aircrew losses was virtually imperceptible at first, but would become more and more evident into 1943. I mean, you can see Japanese accounts of newer pilots coming in that are just worse and worse and worse, and American pilot perceptions where they start out and they're saying like these Zero pilots, they really know what they're doing, they're aggressive, they're tough, but now as of late, we're noticing amongst the good ones, there's not so good ones
Yeah.
starting to filter in. The most significant turn of events was what John Parshall has called a quote twin-headed monster, and that being the air campaigns in New Guinea and the Solomons. Now, these titanic struggles, which stretched out over a year, bled the Japanese Navy Air Service white, and not just the carrier-based units, but the land-based ones as well. There was one side was not dramatically superior to the other in the air war over the South Pacific in 1942 and into 1943. This was a slugfest. The aircraft losses in combat on both sides were high. They work out to being relatively even. Aircraft losses outside of that were higher still, particularly for the Japanese, given their generally poor logistics. Aircrew losses were also higher for the Japanese due to a whole number of factors, less resources to recover downed airmen. And yes, they did try to recover downed airmen. It's just they had a fraction of the resources dedicated to it.
Hmm.
General lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. So you get shot up into zero. Chances are you are also being shot up or
And
on
possibly
fire.
also on fire. Yeah.
Yeah. Fewer places to land damaged aircraft. Not only intermediate airfields, which the Japanese were very slow at building, but also they also had a tendency to piss off the local native population, which would then take out their frustrations on down Japanese airmen. Whereas they would generally be relatively helpful to Allied aircrew. Um, and then the Japanese were also fighting offensively for a large part of the early campaigns, which means they're operating way, way far away from friendly forces. Wildcat gets shot down over Henderson Field. He parachutes down, and there's U.S. Navy ships, and there's Marines everywhere, and uh, chances are he'll hopefully make it back. A Japanese pilot gets shot up over Rabaul, and then it's 560 miles back to Rabaul
Mhm.
in a damaged aircraft. Chances are you're not making it back, and you're not going to find anywhere safe to land and fight
No.
another day. And also, there was a tendency, though not a universal one, to forego parachutes. We know it was common within the Tainan Kokutai specifically, even though higher echelons of the Japanese Navy Air Service, they were constantly telling their pilots to wear parachutes, but the pilots themselves would forego them. And this was also common among bomber crews, which get talked about, of course, less often than fighter crews, but their loss through attrition is also very significant. Um, I often see kind of this basic concept of people on forums or wherever else where they think that the course of the air war was like flipping a switch, where one day the Japanese were slaughtering the Allies, and then the next day the Allies were slaughtering the Japanese because new planes or something like that. The reality is more complex. I like to think of it as two sides kind of walk up to each other in the South Pacific, and then they take turns just punching each other in the face over and over again, and then the Japanese fall over.
Yeah,
They
eventually.
yeah, they traded blow for blow, but the Allies could replace their losses and actually build up their air strength, whereas the Japanese would only grow weaker. I mean, it's a similar story with the Japanese Navy as well. With all that context laid out, I guess I'll answer the
Mhm.
question. So, did the loss of the majority of experienced Navy fighter pilots impact Allied perceptions of the Zero? Certainly. The A6M5 in its various forms was not totally incomparable to an F6F, particularly at low intermediate to low altitudes. Yeah, the SXF was new, clean sheet design. It was clearly superior, but there was a lot more going on than just that. The F6F wasn't a super fighter, but it racked up the kill count of one. The air war in the Pacific shifted from this relatively even slugfest through 1943 and then transitioned into 1944 into really what can only be described as a one sided slaughter that purely looking at aircraft technical characteristics does not explain.
Mhm.
And it was a combination of everything. The Zero was clearly past its best before date by the end of 1943. But more importantly, the average Japanese Navy pilot had declined significantly in quality, and they were increasingly forced to fight outnumbered as the Allies had the luxury of massing their attacks while Japanese had to defend everywhere with ever dwindling resources. So imagine you're a Japanese pilot, you have less than 100 flight hours if you're land based, 100, a lofty 150 if you're a carrier aviator, which is barely enough to know how to fly a plane, much less fight in one, or in the case of carrier aviators, how to land on a carrier. Ozawa, when he was trying to rebuild his air groups before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, was quite vivid and just watching carrier aviators come in and just crash their planes. Uh, and then you're thrust into combat against a superior aircraft flown by better pilots, and you're outnumbered. And then of course there's a whole bunch of other factors, increasing efficiency of Japanese, or pardon me, American radar vectoring of combat air patrol, et cetera, et cetera. It
Mhm.
was just a bad time. Um, and by the time the Japanese tried to mass their air power in the Marianas, you got famous slaughter that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and that was both land-based and carrier-based aviation. The Japanese operational plan was relatively sound. I mean, it was about as good as they could probably come up with. Ozawa arguably won the duel between the admirals, but it didn't matter. The Japanese were thrusting with a broken spear, as I just would describe it.
Yeah.
American pilots reported during the Battle of the Philippine Sea that for the most part, Japanese fighters were timid and at times just downright avoided seeking out combat against their American counterparts. That left dive and torpedo bombers with little to no protection, and they were savaged. And when the Japanese fighters were engaged, they didn't do any better. Um, and you just see this constant downward spiral toward the end of the war.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, that is a very interesting way of laying it out, I think, because yeah, as you said, there is this conception that kind of, and I think I've fallen victim to it a few times of midway, some being promoted as kind of, well, this is the turning point. After this, it's easy street,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's actually not.
Yeah,
uh,
it's an excellent point to make because kind of the perception of, let's say, someone that's moderately informed about the Asia Pacific War, or the Pacific War specifically, is kind of like Pearl Harbor, and then indistinct muttering, and then Midway, and then indistinct muttering, and then Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, nukes.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so it kind of gets this perception of, oh, they hit us at Pearl Harbor, and then we just have all these sweeping victories, and then uh, whereas there's particularly between Pearl Harbor and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they had to kill a lot of Japanese aircrew and
Yeah.
sink a lot of Japanese ships to degrade capability to the point that you kind of see the last whimpers of conventional Japanese air power. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose yeah, because you've obviously got Lexington is sunk at Coral Sea, and Yorktown obviously at Midway.
mhm.
But then I suppose people tend maybe forget that Hornet, which is the last and actually in a slightly upgraded version of the Yorktowns, gets sent to the bottom almost half a year later at Santa Cruz,
Mhm.
which is not something that a Kido Butai who's supposedly been completely crippled by Midway is going to be capable of doing.
Yeah, exactly. The Santa Cruz is the last great gasp of the remaining core of the Japanese naval carrier aviators that had really started the war. In fact, oh God, what's his name? Murata Shigeharu.
Mhm.
He was the torpedo commander and also the leader of the attack wave. Um, at Santa Cruz, he's the one that led the attack that sank Hornet, and it's kind of fitting, as Lundstrom actually details, because he was kind of regarded as probably the leading expert on aerial torpedo warfare in the world, and also one
Mhm.
of the best carrier aviators, and he dies in the attack that sinks Hornet. Um, so it's kind of a fitting end to him, but also it's kind of symbolic of really the last gasp of the Japanese carrier aviators. Another interesting anecdote from that engagement is, of course, that's the first time where the Japanese carrier aviators are really starting to come to grips with exponentially increasing U.S. Navy anti-aircraft,
Yes.
um, where there's one anecdote where one of the few survivors that come back from one of those attacks is almost speechless at the amount of crap that was being thrown at them. They had like no preparation mentally for the increased volume of AA fire.
Yeah. So, much as I hesitate, having seen your Twitter feed, etc., about the recent movie, much as I hesitate to bring it up, but um, as a sort of a shorthand reference, the level of AA fire that's perhaps portrayed by Hollywood more recently is probably better ascribed to that battle than it is to Midway.
Yeah, Midway. It's as Partial and Tully actually pointed out. I guess there's a slight tangent, but it's interesting. Japanese the fleet their primary doctrine for defense against air attack was the helm to maneuver,
Hmm.
whereas with the U.S. Navy it was more leaned toward um, massing AA fire and then maneuvering for specific threats. Um, and in 1942, by Midway at least, there's no clear answer to that question. Both kind of work about as well, but there's a very clear answer even by October 42.
Hmm.
It's very clear that the U.S. way of doing it is the way to go.
Yeah.
Um, whereas the Japanese, they just never get the AA that they need because the Type 96 was a pile of shit.
Yeah. 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 That's putting it kindly, I think. um, so, with all that in mind, where does the A6M0 sit accurately in the context of carrier-based aircraft in the Pacific War?
Yeah, so I think the Zero rightly, it's Japan's most famous combat aircraft. It deserves its place among the most famous aircraft of the Second World War generally. It was an impressive technical achievement when it entered service, and it was fully competitive with its contemporaries and had an outstanding combat record. And it was not just outstanding as a carrier fighter, but as a land-based one as well. Roughly 10,000 Zeros of all variants were produced, making it Japan's most numerous fighter. That all being said, I don't think the Zero should be remembered as some kind of mythical super fighter. One always must place a piece of equipment in its operational and doctrinal context. The Japanese Navy Air Service were world leaders in conducting high intensity air operations over extreme ranges from 1940 to 42, and the Zero was the absolute perfect fighter to conduct them. No other air force in the world at the time could have done what the Japanese Navy Air Service accomplished in 41, 42, as far as projecting air power out to very long ranges. The
Mhm.
fact that the Japanese Navy was able to contest the air over Guadalcanal at all from their base at Rabaul was mind blowing in and of itself. Um, that's a round trip of 900 and something miles. Can't remember off the top of my head. 981, I want to say. Ridiculous range. And and it's like a no big deal. Oh, we'll fly all the way to Rabaul, or all the way to Henderson Field
Mm.
rather, and dogfight over it and then fly back. It was like I think an 8 hour round trip mission. The Zero fared well against every Allied fighter through 1943, but that didn't mean it was one-sided. And that's one thing I really want to emphasize is that Zero didn't just slaughter everything it encountered, particularly the Wildcat, which is often kind of the butt of jokes. It's maligned in documentaries. But really, when you look at it, it was able to compete with the Zero, with in context with those pilots and everything on relatively even terms, and the numbers reflect that. Um, in fact, in many instances, the Wildcat comes off very well, and honestly, it performed very, very well when you look outside of just fighter versus fighter. For example, over Guadalcanal, when you start taking G4M bomber losses into account, the
Yeah.
F4F comes off very well. Um, Zero would serve from summer 1940 all the way through to Japan's surrender. It served as a carrier fighter, a land-based fighter, a seaplane fighter, an interceptor, an escort fighter, a night fighter, a fighter bomber, and a kamikaze. The final Zero variant, which was the which was the A6M8, the Model 64, was set to enter production at war's end. It's often been said that the last variant of the Zero had not changed much from the first, but honestly, that doesn't hold too much water. I won't get into insane detail here, but the Zero had moved far away from its original design concept. And I'll just lay out some general trends. And with the caveat that there are certain models that deviated from the main line and then take data on the A6M8 with some salt. So loaded weight had increased by 740 kilograms, actually, so quite hefty. And the weight went into a multitude of improvements that saw the wing loading increase. That's one indicator for low speed maneuverability. But it exchanged that maneuverability for other performance. Dive performance increased through the variants, as did rate of climb. Altitude performance was improved and top speed increased, though not as much as one would think. For the most part, increased engine power largely offset the added weight of improvements. The wings were shortened, which is one factor for increased dive performance. The ailerons were also shrunk, which allowed for a higher roll rate at higher speeds and improved the Zero as a gunnery platform at higher speeds, one of the main criticisms. Um, as detailed earlier, firepower improved, first by adding additional ammo for the 20 millimeters, then introducing higher velocity cannon, and then complementing and eventually replacing the rifle caliber MGs with 13.2 millimeter heavy machine guns. Protection, of course, also radically improved from none to eventually having armor, bullet-resistant windscreens, automatic fire extinguishers, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Extreme range, which was a main feature of the A6M2 Model 21, was gradually sacrificed, again with the exception of the A6M3 Model 22, which was, I won't get into it, but it's kind of like a
Mm.
wee odd duckling. The range on any variant of the Zero can't be considered anything resembling bad, but it did drop significantly from its lofty heights. Of course, range mattering far less for the Japanese in the latter part of the war, when, to be frank, they didn't need to travel too far to find angry Americans coming to kill them.
No.
Um, as stated before, the Zero was past its prime by 1943, and it kind of became somewhat emblematic of Imperial Japan's failure to win the war quickly. Its rise and fall roughly outlined Imperial Japan's fortunes in the Asia Pacific War as a whole. And I guess with that, I'll end. I'll just again thank Trent Talenko, Military Aviation History, and Kaz for providing me with some sources and feedback on parts of my notes.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is probably going to be one of, if not the longest video on the channel so far, which is somewhat ironic considering it was all about a plane that was stuck on a warship and not a warship itself. um, but there you go. I mean, as we've said, it is pretty much it's a central aspect of the Pacific War. The Pacific War is obviously often cited as the main evidence for the carrier overtaking the battleship as the decisive weapon of sea warfare. So I suppose the one of the most iconic aircraft involved in that definitely needs to be considered when it comes to um, looking at that whole argument in its context as well. And of course, it's also a very interesting topic for anyone who's interested in military vehicles of any description. It's pretty much one of the most recognizable aircraft profiles you see around these when people look at sort of book covers and such like. So yes, thank you very much for all of that research, and hopefully we will revisit some other similarly interesting topics in the future, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about warships at some point. You never know.
Mhm.
There's all sorts of interesting things that can be said, especially I suppose nowadays. Referencing the video, which I suppose probably by the time this goes up will maybe be about a month or so into the past, that I did about the RV petrol, and with all
Mhm.
the clarifications that we're getting from the various wrecks that are being discovered or rediscovered, I should say. Yeah, it certainly looks like it's going to be an interesting time, well, for warships enthusiasts like myself in general, but also I suppose specifically for yourself with your focus on that area and that particular era of conflict with everything suddenly appearing.
Yeah, it's been fascinating actually, watching. Seemed like for a little while there was almost every week at least something
Yeah,
exciting was coming up.
I'm particularly looking forward to it as and when they manage to find Shokaku.
Oh
Uh,
yes.
that'll be because yeah, I mean them discovering that about a third of Karga's mass had disappeared wasn't exactly surprising. um, but yeah, it'd be interesting to see what some of those other carriers that've gone down look like. Um,
Mhm.
but yes, so as I say, once again, many thanks for that. That's a tremendous amount of work that's been put in, and hopefully for those of you listening, it's either cleared up a lot of issues or perhaps hopefully dispelled some myths about the zero in particular, but also in a much broader context, hopefully gives some idea that even with something that is as well known as the zero, there can be an awful lot of misinformation and miscommunication that goes around, and this is why the work of scholars and researchers when it comes to this kind of field, even though it's pushing nearly 70 years after the conflict ended or more, either this work is still not done, and there still needs to be an awful lot more said about it.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I actually loved being here. I'm actually a big fan of the channel, so I get to live my dream. But
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's all
um,
good.
yeah, um, it expanded the scope of this expanded far more than I originally intended. I was aiming for 30 minutes, and we're like pushing 3 hours.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Oh, a slight
Okay.
margin of error there.
Yes. So yeah. So let well, I suppose it's fitting for the zero. It's the zero's exceptionally long range fight, and we've conducted an exceptionally long range talk.
Yeah.
um, but with that, I suppose we should let everyone else who's hopefully listening to this get back to their lives and so on. So yeah, we'll say uh, thanks everyone for listening, if indeed you still are at the end of this, and we hopefully will see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.